Very good morning to
Yeah. So Barry is the guy that organizes it all, and then he walks off just a minute before.
I'm back.
There he is.
I had some logistic problems, blew up my car, so.
Okay.
No worries.
But you don't have to drive. You don't have to drive anymore tonight, so.
That's arranged. That's arranged.
Okay.
Right.
So I guess I'll guess we'll start. But I'll let you, Barry and Sven, the CEOs and the head honchos, the big cheeses of the Friends of the Quaich, just introduce the tasting a little bit, and then we'll go on.
Actually, we're not the big guys, but nevertheless, you're very welcome to enjoy this tasting done by Meug, Jeroen van Dijk, and Stephen Shannon. I met Stephen Shannon last year, 1.5 years ago, in Zammel, of all places. And that was actually one of the best tastings I've joined for that couple of years. So, and there was an opportunity now to arrange this women's masterclass with Jeroen and Sven and Stephen. So we took this opportunity, and first I want to welcome all our new members from this year, because the club has grown very fast. So, but we have still a couple of places left. Everyone understands English?
Yes.
I hope so.
A little bit.
Well, it's going to be a very long night.
Okay, then there's no translation needed. So the other advantage is that
Barry,
all work is done.
we only see the top of your head. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
So all the work is done by Stephen and by Jeroen. So okay, let's kick it.
Right, very cool. Thank you guys for organizing this together with us. As most of you know, this was supposed to be a live tasting back in May, but for some reason this couldn't go on. So that's why we had to do it a different way. And when Barry called me to say let's do it online together with Friends of the Quaich, of course I was very quick to say yes, because why not? We're tasting whiskey. For the people that don't know me, I am from Meug. Meug is with a big word, a tasting agency. We organize tastings, all kinds of tastings with all kinds of drinks. And I'm not going to bore you too much with all the details, but as you might know, we also normally organize a festival each year. This was supposed to happen at the 31st of October, but for some reason we can't organize that this year. So actually yesterday, I think, we launched our alternative, and we have a completely online festival going on from the 29th of October till the 1st of November. If you go to the website meug.be, it's spelled like this, Meug, you'll find a list of everything that's going on. There's all kinds of pretty cool tastings going on, actually. I'll just tell you about the whiskey ones. We've got, together with Sinoco, Douglas Lang, and Braakman Distillers from Belgium, we've got a masterclass in grain whiskies. 145 years of grain whiskey, it's called. So we're having 3 of the Belgian grain whiskies, and then 4 of the single cask bottlings that Douglas Lang did. Amongst others is a 40-year-old, 2 30-year-olds. So and it's Sebastian Braakman himself, together with Stuart Baxter, the brand ambassador from Douglas Lang, who's going to host that tasting. And I'll be in the middle a little bit, trying not to talk too much. And then the second whiskey one that's going on is on the Saturday. And there we've got our big friend Jurgen Vromans, the whiskey mercenary. And he'll be hosting a tasting. As many of you will probably know, he bottles his own whiskies, but he's also importing other smaller independent bottlers. And as it happens, he has 6 brands now: Lady of the Glen, Dram, Liquid Treasures, Whiskey Mercenary, of course, and forgot the last one. But we'll have a panel with 1 bottle of each of these bottlers, and all the bottlers are there too. So we've got a panel with 6 independent bottlers together talking about whiskey. So I think that's going to be pretty cool to follow too. And then there's a masterclass in Madeira wines. There's some beer tastings going on. There's a quiz if you want to do the quiz, drinks quiz with us. So there's lots of stuff happening. Just check out meug.be and you'll find anything you want about that. As a final thing before I introduce Stephen, if you want, at the end of the tasting, you'll be able to order any of these bottles that we're going to taste, except for the one that Friends of the Quaich offered to as an extra. I'll put a link into the chat window, and you get to our website, and you can order the bottles, and we can send them to you if you want to. If you don't want to buy from us, perfect. Go to your local store. Please don't order online from the Holland or wherever. Go to your local store, support your locals. That's the most important thing for me. We're not a shop, as you know, but we like to offer the opportunity for you to get these bottles if you want. Yeah, so the tasting itself, we're going to have 8 whiskeys. It's going to be about 7 hours of tasting, I think. I'll let Stephen do most of the talking, but I have prepared, Stephen, 8 questions, each linking to one of these whiskeys to introduce them, and then I'll let you talk, and then we'll see what happens. I'll be kind of moderating this. If anybody has a question, please don't hesitate to ask them. If you don't feel like speaking up, you can also put it in the chat window. I'll see that. I'll follow the chat window while we're busy, and I'll get the questions asked, and we'll get all the secrets out of Stephen's head, I think, tonight. So
I will also try to follow the chat to help you, Jeroen.
Perfect. Oh yeah, please don't be offended if I hear too much noise somewhere, background noise. I might mute you, but not Stephen, of course, but all the other ones. I might mute you just to keep this nice and clean going on. I'm also recording this, so if anybody wants to rewatch this afterwards, buy 8 bottles and do the tasting again. You'll be happy to know that's possible on our YouTube channel. I'll send you the link afterwards too. But well, enough talk. Stephen, welcome. I'm very happy to have you here online with us. Introduce yourself. Tell me about who you are and what we're going to do tonight.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending your Friday evening sitting and listening to me waffle on. It's very much appreciated. My name's Stephen Shand. I am the blender and brand manager for Wemyss Malts, which is an Edinburgh-based company. I joined you from Edinburgh. That's Edinburgh over there. Been based in Edinburgh since 2006, and I've been working in the whiskey industry for 9 years. I started with Scotch Malt Whisky Society for 4 years, ran their external members tasting, was a panel member as well for a long time. Then I moved and set up a whiskey shop on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, which if you've been is kind of the prime real estate in Edinburgh for whiskey shops and tourist tap shops and everything else in between. I worked as a consultant for a couple of years for a lot of craft spirits brands as well. And yeah, I joined Wemyss 4 years ago, initially in kind of brand marketing, which I still do, but I always had that interest in whiskey, which led into me running the tasting panels with Charlie McLean and Isabella Wemyss. And then eventually, kind of as blending rules happen in the industry, as and when a blender is needed, you kind of put yourself forward and jump into it. So for the last kind of 2.5 years, I've retrained as a whiskey blender and spend I've got a dual role essentially in blending and in the brand marketing of Wemyss Malts. So pick my brains, ask me any questions. The harder, the better. Hopefully I can answer them all. As a few of you know from tastings you might have seen me do in person, I tend to go off on tangents and various odd subjects. So Jeroen, you can keep me on track. I'll
try.
Yeah, and we've just got a nice chilled out tasting. I've not prepped a huge amount. I think it's just nice to have it more kind of conversationally. And yeah, we'll just crack on and ask
cool.
questions as and when.
Stephen, there's people already asking for what's the lineup and what's the first whiskey we're going to taste. I guess we're not going to give the entire lineup now, but we're going to go through it one at a time.
I wasn't sure if you had kept it secret or if
Yeah.
you had published the whole thing.
Well,
Now,
no, they know which bottles they're tasting. So they have labels on the samples, but they just know the order yet. Don't know the order yet. So,
yeah,
but we'll
now,
start with the Kingsbarns.
yes. So Kingsbarns is a good one to start with for a couple of reasons. I think in terms of liquid style, it's one of the lightest. Also, I think it's just a nice subject to kind of talk about as it's kind of the latest thing with our company and what we've been developing. So let me go to rabbit. Oh, also, just before we get started, since we're doing a kind of nice cultural swap, I thought I see some of you drinking beer already. So
All right, you're having
now,
Chimney.
unfortunately, I ran out of time. I would have gone to the good beer shop, but I ran out of time. And so I had to go to the cheapo beer shop. And the only Belgian beers they had was Chimney and Le Chouffe, which are all right.
Chimney's
But
nice.
I would have preferred, my number one is Duchess de Bouillon. I
Mm.
like the Flemish Reds, and I was going to go to the fancy beer shop and get that, but we ran out. And please don't judge me on my glass. I've only got a pint glass because, you know.
Oh, but I see people taking notes already on the kind of glasses you're using. So
Yeah, sorry, I've got an endless amounts of whiskey glasses and blending equipment, and then I went in my cupboard and I was like, oh crap, I've only got pint glasses for the beer. But yeah, let's start with a 9% beer. Anyway, happy Friday, everybody, and to a lovely weekend. So, cheers.
cheers.
Right.
So
Cool.
I guess everybody's been nosing and tasting the Kingsbarns already. So tell us about what makes Kingsbarns unique. What's special about it?
Yeah, so I mean, the story of Kingsbarns really developed in around about 2010, 2011, and it was a gentleman called Doug Clement. Now, Doug is a golf caddy who lives in Fife. Fife. Tell you what, let's do share screen, and I'll pull up some slides for this. Don't worry, there's not going to be endless slides. It is a Friday night, so I don't want to make it too geeky. But let's this will help a little bit with what I'm talking about. If I can just get to, there we go. So
I'll also change my background to the whiskey that's appropriate that we're tasting.
there we go. So yeah, Kingsbarns, it was kind of the brainchild of a gentleman called Doug Clement, who's a golf caddy in Fife. He still is a golf caddy in Fife. And at that time, really, there wasn't any distilleries of prominent note in Fife. Fife as a region. So you can see here we've got the 5 regions of Scotland. If you're not familiar, the Lowlands. Some people kind of mistakenly think the Lowlands ends at the Central Belt here, but actually it incorporates this county, or what used to be the medieval kingdom of Fife. Now going back to 2010. We had Cameron Bridge Distillery, which is the largest grain distillery in Scotland. It was actually built on Wemyss land. The Wemyss family, I don't know why I'm pointing at me, I'm not a member of the Wemyss family, I'm not that rich. But the Wemyss family, their historical kind of home is Fife, especially this region here of East Fife. They've got castles there and farmland and various amounts of kind of estates that used to be coal mining and that kind of thing. That's where the Wemyss family originate. They sold land to the Haigs, the Haigs and the Steins. You might know of Haig Club whiskey, but back 150 years ago, they were prominent. Depending on which historians you talk to, anything from whiskey pioneers to whiskey gangsters, who would do all sorts of weird things like.
Isn't that a synonym? Pioneers and gangsters?
Well, I think back then people did whatever they could to kind of get ahead and get ahead of the competitors. Anything from diverting water sources from your competitors' distilleries to cut them off, to lending very dodgy high interest rate loans to bankrupt their competitors, all sorts of strange things. And half the time the competitors are actually their family members. So the Haigs and the Steins were intermarried. So actually a huge amount of whiskey innovation happened in Fife. Geographically, you're not in a really remote place. So a lot of the kind of large scale malt and then grain production in the Victorian era was pioneered in Fife. Things like the first canals used to transport between distilleries, the first rail tracks, it all happened in Fife. But then there was a kind of boom and bust, as there has been with so many times in whiskey, and that area kind of collapsed. There was no distilleries. There was Cameron Bridge Grain Distillery and Strathmill, which is a little bit older than Kingsbarns. I think it's got about 9 years on us. So there's only 2 distilleries in the region, We've now got 6, I believe, if you include the grain distillery. But so, sorry to go back. Doug Clement, the founder, really, you know, he was a golf caddy. He was taking around golfers from Europe, from America, and they finished around the golf. And I was like, well, I want to go to a distillery. But at the time, you know, Kingsbarns is here. If they wanted to go visit a distillery, they had to go to Glenkinchie, just outside of Edinburgh, which is about an 1.5-hour drive, or they had to go up to Perthshire to Deanston or Glenturret, which is another kind of hour drive. So he thought, why isn't there good representatives of single malt in Fife? It's a historical region. I would actually make an argument now with the amount of distilleries we have. You could almost have Fife as its own kind of 6th whiskey region, but that's to be debated for the future. So that's kind of the initial idea.
The new Campbelltown.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there's such a boom now. We're up over 140 distilleries, so you have these kind of new clusters. And the one thing I would say, if you wanted to pick a character trait of Fife distilleries, is that they have no set characteristic. Mm-hmm. There's innovation, there's unusual techniques going on. It kind of is in a nice way, in the kind of pioneering edge of whiskey distillation. I would say Kingsbarns, although pioneering in certain things like its wood policy, we are still fairly traditional in our roots of production and style.
Just a small technical question, Stephen. Can you put up your volume a little bit? Somebody's asking if you can turn it up a little bit. For me, it's perfectly fine. But
I'll try and speak up as well. But let me just jump into my settings and hopefully I can turn it up. Microphone settings. Is that any better?
Now we've got some static.
I'll turn it down a little bit. How's that?
Yeah. Well, for me it was okay, but Koen,
well, I'll speak up a little bit as well.
That's perfect.
Yeah,
that'll work. Yeah.
All right, I'll speak a little bit slower as well. So yeah, that's Kingsbarns Distillery there, and what that is an old farmsteading building. So in Fife, there was a lot of kind of freeholdings of farmers, and this was an old, dilapidated farmsteading. It was used as like a wedding venue in the 70s, and then nothing else. It was in really, really shoddy condition. Now, part of the Wemyss family business is we do restorations of buildings. Usually they're townhouses in Edinburgh and Glasgow City, and they're converted into beautiful homes that are then sold. But it kind of had us perfectly placed. You know, we were already producing whiskey under the guise of Wemyss Malts since 2005. So our kind of background in whiskey production, and then also our kind of experience in renovating buildings, kind of had us perfectly poised to take over this project. So in 2014, Wemyss family kind of stepped in and took ownership of the project with a healthy amount of funding from the EU.
Thank you.
And then, we had it built and operated and running. And I think we're 5 years of single malt production now. Damn, that's going fast. Yeah. So we're getting on. The first whiskey that we released is called Dream to Dram, and that's the whiskey that you have in front of you just now. It's not 5 years old. We've kept it at 3. So when we released this first in 2018, I think we're on to our 4th bottling of this now. We've kept it at 3 years old to keep the character consistent, but also it allows us to keep stock back to start bringing out some 5-year-olds, shall we say, fairly soon, without giving anything away. But yeah, Kingsbarns, if we want to talk about its production, its style, first thing, local barley. We wanted to establish Kingsbarns in the roots of Fife as much as possible, make it a localized product. So for us, it was really, really important that we use Fife barley. Now, just out of luck, my colleague Mike has just made this excellent video. It's only 1.5 minutes, but I thought this would better explain the barley production than I could. So I'm just going to fire this on, and hopefully you can hear it.
Fife barley really is perfect.
Stephen, we don't see the video. We only hear it.
All our barley locally.
Right.
Actually, from just a few miles down the coast from.
Technical glitches. Let me try again. Share screen. This one. Can you see the video now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Right. And was the audio good?
Yeah, it started out
Yeah.
quite loud, but it was better after a second or two.
Right, okay, let's try this again.
Fife barley really is perfect for what we're doing here at Kingsbarns. We source all our barley locally, actually from just a few miles down the coast from here. And the region is perfect for that purpose. You've got well-draining soil, you know, a relatively mild, dry climate. And then at this time of year in autumn, when we're looking to go into harvest, you've got long hours of sunshine, a little bit of breeze to dry the crop before it goes into storage.
My grandfather, my father, and myself and my sons have farmed in this area for 100 years. And that's a long, long time in farming. So I'm very proud of that. Our barley is great for producing Kingsbarns whisky. The reason for that is that it produces excellent malt.
Scottish whisky is quite a simple product in some respects. You know, there's not very many ingredients you can put into it. You've got malting barley, water, in our case, drawn from directly below the distillery, yeast, and then of course, thyme in oak casks as well. The quality of the barley is reflected in the end product. Not just how many litres of alcohol you can squeeze out of every ton of malt, but in the flavour as well. So using locally grown barley, it anchors the spirit to this place.
Cool. So I thought that would just be worth showing. I mean, interestingly, that video was shot like last week. So the cutting of the barley you're seeing is this year's harvest. So that will then go to Munros in Yorkshire, and that will be dried. Then it'll come back up to Scotland, and that will be laid and dried, and we'll have it in storage for about 6 months, and then we'll start using that for the production. But yeah, so local Fife barley is the first step. As Peter, the distillery manager there, said, we're using local water, which is obviously fairly common for distilleries. We use what's called an aquifer, so that pulls out the water directly below the distillery. It's about several thousand years old sandstone filtered water. You just need good quality water. I'm not one of these people that prescribes to water influencing the character of whiskey. I know some people do. I think that is practically all marketing nonsense. I think good quality water, and that'll do it. I hope to stir debate there. If anybody wants to ask why or has any questions, we can get that debate at some point.
Maybe you should stop sharing the Facebook screen.
Oh, excuse me.
Bart Baas is asking stuff. But,
Okay. God, that this share screen thing's confusing. Right.
There we go. And if you put there we go. So if I understand correctly, that you're also into this terroir-driven, this terroir idea of Kingsbarns, so the local products, ingredients.
Yeah, terroir is a dangerous word to use, dare I say.
That's why I said it.
That's describing a entire flavor style to a region. I think more we're just thinking about locality, and we're wanting to use ingredients that are close to heart. And if that helps infer and influence the flavor, that's great. I mean, Bill Whiteford that you saw there, he said his family have been working on that land for 100 years. That's actually Wemyss lands. Wemyss family rent that land to those farmers, and it's just a lovely full circle story of the family and what we're doing. So yeah, there are some elements that terroir's a tricky one. I won't fall into that pitfall.
I'm trying to let you trip up on these kinds of words, but of course this is very tricky to talk about.
You can keep doing that. So yeah, let's move past the barley and the water. In terms of production, fermentation times, we range from 72 to 120 hours. Why such a big range? Weekends. Our staff don't work on the weekends, which is quite common with some distilleries. So you can see fermentation times change from as much as 60 hours to 120 hours. In terms of 72 to 120, that puts us on the kind of medium to long end of fermentation times. And basically, the longer you ferment, the more ester development that you create. Esters will translate into things like banana, tropical fruits, much more kind of complex fruity characteristic in whiskey. Also, the other key thing to keep in mind with fermentation is if you run what's called either a cloudy wort or a clear wort. So you can, and if you're familiar with beer production, there's some similarities here. Use something called a Borlath system, and you reintroduce the wash to the top of the fermentation, and that will clarify it. And the kind of given understanding with in terms of flavor is if you run a cloudy wort, you'll develop more nutty flavor. If you run a clear wort, you tend to develop more fruity, lighter flavor. So we run a clear wort as possible. Then when it comes to distillation, 2 times distilled. I know a lot of people think that Lowlands equals triple distillation. In fact, there's only one distillery that still does triple distillation, Auchentoshan. And even back in its heyday, 100 years ago, there was only a couple. It was a mix. There was double distillation and triple distillation to help achieve that kind of desired lighter character that blenders wanted. And that's why Lowland whiskey is the more on the lighter style. What we do to achieve that characteristic is we run the stills as slow as possible. Peter, who you saw in the video, Peter calls it slow and low. So that means that they run them slow over a long period of time, but also they turn the temperature up slowly. So he says a low temperature. So we bring the spirit, the wash, into the stills and gradually bring up that temperature very, very slowly. And that's to help inhibit as much, to create as much reflux as possible. Reflux is your spirit to copper contact, that condensation from vapor back to spirit inside the still. So the more reflux you get, the more that helps achieve a lighter, fruitier character, but also it helps strip out any of the kind of sulfurs or more beefier compounds that have been created in the fermentation. We use a shell and tube condensers. We don't use worm tubs. Quite compact shell and tube condensers, but they're very, very efficient. Basically, the whole distillery has been designed to pump out the lightest, cleanest, freshest new make that we can get. We did actually have the new make out in market in Belgium, so you might be able to get it. You'll probably get it for like less than 20 euros for a 20 CL in some of the shops. It's well worth trying if you're into new make and really understanding the DNA of a character. I mean, I don't mean to kind of toot our own horn, but Kingsbarns is regularly talked about as having one of the best new makes or for a new distillery in the industry, and a huge amount has been done there.
I think that, sorry to interrupt you, but I think the explanation you just gave about long fermentations, about slow distillations, it makes a lot of sense when you're tasting the whiskey, because it's only 3-year-old, but it's really mellow, I would say. It's really very, very nice already. It doesn't taste like a 3-year-old at all.
Well, one of the things we knew is we were going to release young. It was one of the strategies of the distillery. That's part of the kind of financial investment, to be brutally honest. You know, we set up the distillery. We relatively early. If you take a distillery, another Lowland distillery like Glenkinchie, for example, when you get to Glenkinchie at 12 years old, it's lovely and peachy and soft and fruity. But you walk into that distillery, it reeks of sulfur. And the new make spirit is sulfury. So it needs that 12 years for the sulfur to be taken out and stripped away by the cask. Whereas Kingsbarns, we designed it to be as clean and sulfur-free as possible. So at 3 years, it's still a drinkable spirit. I probably shouldn't have said right at the beginning it's 3 years old, because that maybe sets people off. But it just shows that age isn't everything. And if you design a distillery well enough, if you use the right kind of wood policy, and if you blend with the right type of casks when you're producing that single malt, you can achieve quite a lot of interesting things. And for me, the standout that really just gave me the wow factor when I tried Kingsbarns for the first time at 3 years old is the ester profile leans into exotic fruits. So papaya, mango, a little bit of banana. Those are advanced ester creation and profiles. And to see that in a young spirit is quite unique, and is a very good sign of what will be complexity in the spirit. Sorry, I've got someone speaking. I couldn't hear fully. I'll talk very quickly about wood policy, the casks that we use. So we worked with a gentleman called Dr. Jim Swan, who is sadly no longer with us after the last couple of years. Jim was a whiskey consultant who worked for many, many distilleries, and not just Scottish distilleries. I mean, in Scotland, he's known for working with Kingsbarns, Glasgow Distillery, Wolfburn, Kilchoman, a lot of the kind of new wave distilleries, the post 2005, really after kind of Arran and Kilchoman kind of set the new wave of distilleries off. He also worked with a lot of international distilleries. So I think there's even a Belgian distillery. I've forgotten its name. I think it makes Carolus beer, but it's also a distillery.
Het Anker, Gouden Carolus.
Right. I think
in Mechelen, I think you worked with them too, yeah.
Yeah, so I think Swan worked with those guys. Kavalan in Taiwan, you know, he did a huge amount for developing wood policy for distilleries. So what he decided for Kingsbarns, and this is the exact profile that you're drinking, is first fill bourbon. So I've got it in a single cask example there. So the first fill bourbon casks, they come from Heaven Hill Distillery in Kentucky. We don't go through any third-party bonds or Speyside cooperage. There's a direct relationship that Isabella Wemyss, who is the sister of the founder, she heads up our cask logistics and spirit logistics for Kingsbarns and for Wemyss. I might even have that's William on the left, and that's Isabella Wemyss on the right. So that's the founders of the company, and they don't just sit back and kind of, we founded it and off they go. They're heavily involved in the daily operations. So Isabella does a huge amount, as I said, in terms of sourcing spirits and casks. William kind of takes Diageo people out up to the golf course and woos them into letting us buy casks of Clynelish or whatever, you know. But yeah, so Isabella's done a really good job in terms of cask allocation, and first fill bourbon, Heaven Hill. So that's where you're going to get a lot of the vanillins, the vanilla flavors from the casks, the coconut, those traditional American oak bourbon cask, the bourbon barrels that we use, not hogsheads. But then the kind of secret spice, the interesting ingredient, and this is a Jim Swan creation. And if you look at this color, 3-year-old whiskey.
Right.
That is called an STR Barrique, shaved, toasted, and recharged. And this has become quite prominent in the last 2 years. There's a few distilleries that started to release STRs, and they are the brainchild of Jim Swan. So what he's done is he has sourced fresh Portuguese red wine barriques from Portugal, obviously. And then at the, I don't know if you call them a bodega in Portuguese, they might be called something else.
The Quinta.
Quinta, okay, there we go. So what they do is they set another fire inside the cask, and they scrape the cask, they de-char it, they take off that level of kind of wine-infused area of the cask. It's not actually as deep as a lot of people think. There's a bit of a misconception about spirit penetration and wine penetration into casks. It's actually pretty mild. It only really goes into the first millimeter of the wood. You hear all these stories about wine and spirit kind of breathing into the cask and then coming back out, and people will show you staves where it shows the penetration going, you know, a centimeter into the cask. That's all nonsense. It's just because the two staves are close together, you see the seepage coming down the side. So when you shave those casks, it's actually only a couple of mil that you need to take off. What that's doing is it's exposing fresh oak where you've got a higher concentration of tannin. And also because it hasn't had high volatile spirit like American whiskey in there, there's a lot of tannins and sugars still in the wood. That's what gives you this really impactful, intense tannin influence and sweet influence on the cask. Also, it's heavily charred. So that carbon char on the inside of the cask works as a very efficient filter. So as I was saying, how we designed the distillery to strip out any sulfur, if at any chance there is sulfur left in the spirit at this point, if it's sat in an STR cask, it'll be gone very quickly. That char is, that carbon char just has a huge amount of surface area. If you take 1 centimeter squared of carbon char and flattened it out to 1 molecular depth, it would be the size of a football field. You know, there's a huge amount of surface area, so it'll just absorb up all of those sulfurs, and that's what leads to a very, very clean spirit.
So in these Portuguese casks are European oak?
They are European. Oh, yes, they are. They're European.
Right.
Sorry, I had to think there for a second. So what you have there is in your Dream to Dram, so this is Dream to Dram, you have 90% of the casks, so it's actually 18 casks is first fill bourbon, and then 2 casks are the STR barriques.
Okay.
So that together, and then we don't empty the whole vat. This is something we've learned from Wemyss and from blending whiskey, to help with consistency, we'll always keep at least a third of that vat for the next bottling, and then we for the next vatting, and that helps roll and keep the character developing over time. Yeah, and that's what ends up being your Dream to Dram that you've got in your glass. 46
Very cool.
filtered, and that's our kind of flagship whiskey. Dream to Dram kind of, I came up with a name. It was roughly named after Doug Clement and his idea of turning this old farmsteading into his dream of a whiskey distillery. We do have some single cask releases. We've done a family reserve, which is a cask strength bottling of Dream to Dram, and we will have some new releases imminently once we get all our bottling, which was planned for the entire year and has now been squashed into a single month of September.
Nice.
So once we get through all that bottling, we'll have some interesting new products as well. But hopefully this is the first, and maybe it's the first time people have tried Dream to Dram, the Kingsbarns. Maybe they've started to become familiar with it, which is great. You know, single malt, it's a slow and long game. We're wanting to build a nice steady reputation. We've picked a particular way of doing things. We're not going, and there's no right or wrong here, but we're not going the kind of route of having lots and lots of different releases and lots of different cask types and spirit styles. We're very much sticking to
getting your baseline right and then expanding.
Yeah, and just so people think of Kingsbarns and they know of that kind of light, delicate spirit character and the 90-10 bourbon STR that we do. But we're 5 years in now, so you're going to start seeing a little bit of variation on the releases there.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea to do it that way and really get your name and your flavor profile out, and then you can start expanding with different kinds of stuff if you want to. There's a couple of reactions in the chat already of people who really like it, are impressed with the fact that it's only 3 years old. So there's also a question: what is the difference between a new cask and an STR cask? Maybe that's already been explained during your explanation.
No, I mean there's some that comes up quite a lot, and also some people ask what's the difference between a dechar rejuvenated cask and an STR cask. So a new cask, let's take American oak for example. We would call that, once it comes to Scotland, a virgin oak cask. So that has not had any spirit in it whatsoever. And what that means is, so basically the higher the alcohol, the more solvent it is, and the more it's going to suck things up. So if you put like 70% American new make spirit into a cask, it's very efficient at pulling out a lot of the, well, depending on the strength and the humidity, it'll pull out either a lot of the tannins or a lot of the sugars. So it's very efficient at that. If you avoid that, you have what we call the virgin oak cask, and that just means that we get to have all those really intense extreme tannins and sugars and lignans influencing our whiskey. It's not used that commonly in Scotland because there's a tradition in Scotland that we use reused barrels, and that's what gives us a nice bit of variety and nuance and not that intense spirit hit. But they have been used since at least 1993. I first came into contact with virgin oak, new oak casks at Scotch Malt Whisky Society with whiskey called, well, it was distillery name G5, which is Invergordon, which we'll be having later. And they were Bill Lumsden Glenmorangie experiments with just virgin oak matured grain whiskey. And I would just be at the bar and I'd shout out G5, and just everyone in the bar would just be like G5, and everyone would come and get a dram of it. It was like amazing stuff. So yeah, virgin oak, I love that intense flavor, but admittedly it's a little bit of a blunt instrument. It can overpower, it can overwhelm new make spirit. So instead, we looked at this STR, which is using something that's had wine in it already, so it's no longer a virgin cask. And then we do that process of dechar and recharring, basically to expose some new wood and to get some more carbon in there to help with the filtration. That dechar rechar is different from what's called a rejuvenated cask, which are also in the industry, and that can be, you know, say we use an American oak barrel 3 times over the course of 30 years. You know, that oak, traditionally they would just chuck that away. It'd be broken up to be wood chippings for gardening or smoking salmon or turning into furniture or whatever. But actually what's happened in the last kind of 30, 40 years is we've realized that all we need to do is take away a couple of mil from the inside of the cask, and we're back to the fresh oak. Like I was saying, a misconception. I mean, how many, I don't know if the raise your hand thing will work here, but how many people have been told, and I've been told in Kentucky, I've been told in distilleries in Scotland that the spirit penetrates fairly deep into the cask, and they've shown you a stave with spirit penetration. I mean, I think it's fair to say quite a few people have said that, and it's common knowledge. It's actually a complete factoid, and I'll jump ahead in my presentation because I knew it would come up. I think it's this last slide here.
There we are.
Sorry, let me close down on my stupid Instagram posts that are coming up. So you'll see here. In fact, that slide's better. So this is a wine cask. So this is what the guys at the distillery love to show you on the tours. They'll go, look at that.
Your sound is off.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
So that picture on the left, they'll go, yeah, look at how deep that wine has penetrated into the cask. But then if you cut the stave, look at the picture on the right, you can actually see that it's not penetrated anywhere near as deep as people say. It's just seeped into the gap between the staves. So what we've learned with rejuvenating casks is all you need to do is strip away 1 or 2 mil, then retoast it and rechar it, and boom, that cask is good to go.
As good as new.
Well, it's not as good as new.
No.
You've got a slightly different profile than a virgin oak, but you can also tweak them. You know, you can go for a heavy toasting or a light toasting. There's a little bit of variation there, so we can actually get into Bill Lumsden coined them designer barrels, because you can go to this extent of tweaking them as much as possible to play around with different flavor styles. So that's what I'd say the key difference between those 3 cask types are. That
cool. I'm going to be very strict here because we've talked for a long time already about Kingsbarns. It's lovely to talk about. But I think we have to go on to the next one to just not be dry. But anybody want to add anything about the Kingsbarns? What do you think about this? How do you like it? Before we go on, the next one we'll have is the Strathmill, actually.
Jeroen, there was one question from Whisky and Vera. How much kilo of barley is necessary to start up a distillation?
Oh, that's a good question. I think our barley bin is 20 ton, and that lasts us a week. I don't have that off the top of my head, but if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll look it up. I assume that question is specifically to Kingsbarns and not just in general. If you leave that with me, I will look that up and I will come back and give you an answer. Sorry, I don't have all these facts in my head.
No.
Well, Jerome, do you want to? Are we introducing the next whiskey?
The next one we're having is the Strathmill, the 1994 Strathmill, which is called Butterscotch Ice Cream on your labels. It also says Strathmill normally on the labels too. So.
It does.
And it says here on the bottle, bottled in 2018 and 277 bottles made of this. And I'll also read the tasting notes because I always love these tasting notes. A silky textured and sweet hogshead with vanilla and brown sugar notes.
Good. Oh, that's a little tasting note on the bottom. So I write most of the tasting notes and help name them as well. Right, I might have an answer to that question just before we move on.
Also, I'm changing my background to the Strathmill Distillery now.
Ah, damn, this is just liquid measurements. It's not barley. Because it's a 4,500 litre charge, 7,500 litre wash. What would that translate into? I do have a calculation for that, but I forgot. Right, I'll come back to that. We'll maybe get to it. Let's jump ahead with the Strathmills. Apologies, but I'll try and get that answer for you.
No worries. I guess everybody's tasting it already, but the question I had is like, we've talked about Kingsbarns now, about the distillery. Now we're going on to Wemyss, of course, which you do blends, you do blended malts, you do single casks. Tell us maybe about Wemyss as a company. About we had a little bit of history already, but who are the people now working there? What is the company like?
Yeah, well, I'll jump back into my presentation just to show you those pictures again. So Wemyss as a company, we were founded in 2005 by William. William Wemyss, he has a background in various aspects of what we call Wemyss developments, which is everything from hydro energy to avocado farms in Australia. But one of his favorites is a winery in France that his dad owns. It's called Rumoresque wine, and it specializes in kind of Provence rosé style wine. And we actually own that company, and we had sales agents in in France, who are basically like, well, you know, you're a Scottish company, we're selling your French wine, but then during the winter, we're not really selling any rosé. Why don't you have any Scotch? So that's kind of where this kind of pressure and idea started building around about 2002. And William always had it in the back of his mind that he would love to have a Scotch whisky brand to fit within the company's range of spirits that they wanted to develop. By his own admission, he didn't really know a lot about whiskey. He enjoyed it, but you know, he didn't know enough to get fully started. So that's where he met the gentleman you'll see on this slide, who some of you might be familiar with, and this is Charlie McLean. So Charlie McLean is a whiskey writer of fairly high repute. He does many different whiskey books. He these days is a consultant. It wouldn't be right to say that Charlie works only for us or that these are Charlie's whiskies. You know, he's a kind of gun for hire. He'll work for anyone in the industry who needs his expertise. Charlie really came into prominence in the 1980s because he helped develop this, which is the whiskey flavor wheel, which I think is one of the first examples of flavor wheels. You know, now we have flavor wheels for coffee, for beer, for cannabis. You know,
Tell us about the cannabis flavor wheel.
Well, interestingly, there are biological similarities. You know, if you get into flavor, and this actually ties in quite neatly with what we're talking about. Some people read our tasting notes or read tasting notes in general and just go, those are pretentious. They are nonsense. Now, yes, some tasting notes can be pretentious. I've sat in tasting panels where somebody has said it tastes like pink space dust, or said it's like a roast dinner, but on a square plate, not a round plate. So yes, pretentious tasting notes do exist. But if we're talking about aroma and flavor and what creates aroma and flavor, they are congeners, they are biological molecules. There are things like terpenes. So if I talked about, you know, I mentioned Auchentoshan earlier, a triple distilled light delicate Roland. I have one here. That has a high concentration of two particular terpene congeners called citronella and lemonol. So obviously aromas and flavors of citrus and lemon. It's because they exist in barley. They're biological, they exist there. And by fermentation and fractional distillation, we can enhance the citrus notes. Now, those exact same congeners, citronella and lemonol, exist on the skin of fruit and in fruit. Hence, the thing that makes this taste like lemon is the exact same thing that makes the lemon taste like lemon. The exact same thing that if you did have a cannabis flavor wheel and it said citronella in it, it's the exact same thing. We actually use citronella as a midgie spray in sprays to get rid of bugs. It's just all the exact same biological compounds. So if you smell a whiskey and says, oh, it smells a bit like orange or it smells like lemon, someone says you're being pretentious. You're not. It's the same building blocks. So it's that same idea that Charlie uses to develop this flavor wheel and that we use in our tasting notes and to expand our into our names. And that's like a kind of key element of Wemyss. All of our whiskies are named off of what we get in the nose and in the taste. We could call it McTaggart's Highland Bay or whatever, you know, but we like to just cut to the chase and try and the tasting note. And that inspiration really came from Charlie in the development of that flavor wheel.
It's not as how would I put it, esoteric as the Scotch Malt Whisky Society ones that
Well, I mean, I can quite happily say that with confidence, yes, because I worked there for 4 years. And I mean, a lot of that comes down to just the differences in our businesses. I don't think they're trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. They're being playful. They're wanting to be imaginative with the language. And Christ, I mean, they're bottling 500 single casks a year. We bottle 60. So they've got to give some kind of differentiation and point of view. So that's where these kind of over the top. I mean, I remember the first week I started at SNWS, they had a whiskey. It was a Sherry Gorda Ardmore. I'll never forget it because it was called Whiskey Flavored Condoms and Skunk Roadkill. Sold out.
Sold out. Yeah.
You know, it was dare I say, rubbery. And,
rubbery, yeah.
So yeah, tasting notes are an interesting one, and obviously there's a huge amount of subjectivity there. Even subjectivity in yourself. What time of day are you tasting that whiskey or smelling that whiskey? Have you had a breakfast or some strong coffee beforehand? So you
Yeah.
can
Even the mood you're in.
Yeah,
You're in
absolutely.
a good mood, bad mood. Yeah.
There's so much there, but that's really the key, and that's the heart that we took from Charlie. So Charlie is still part of our panel. Now, it's not like SMWS where we sit down in a boardroom and there's 7 of us. We've got too many other things going on, to be honest. So what happens is Charlie will go with Isabella for like a 4-hour lunch and a cardboard box full of whiskey samples that she's pulled from various warehousing. It'll get first Charlie seal of approval, so that's a 10-point scoring system. If it scores a 5 or above, it's good for bottling. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll bottle it, but usually we will. If it scores usually between a 3 and a 4, then that might be put back into, well, it'll stay in warehousing, or we might look at re-racking it. But everything has to have that kind of Charlie seal of approval. And I do find that very important, especially when I go to, say, like markets like Germany, and every man and his dog is an independent bottler. Every shop owner has a huge spectrum of single cask whiskies that they've bottled themselves. I think it is good to have a benchmark of quality and somebody we know is very good at that. So Charlie and Isabella will do the kind of first pass of the whiskies. Then those samples will come to me, and I will sit with, I could be by myself here. I could just pull in the sales team or some of our marketing team. I might have a friend in the whiskey industry, and we'll sit and we'll write some longer form tasting notes.
Or just some random guy from Belgium you invite.
Oh, maybe one time. We'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, back when, before the world ended, you know, if you wanted to come to the office, yeah, it'd be okay. You could pop in. I mean, it's not like an office that you can come and do tours. It's a closed door business, but you gave us notice, and when things get back to normal, of course.
So all 17 people here, all 19 people have duly noted that, the invitation.
Don't hold me to that. 9% shimmy, god damn it. But yeah, so that's kind of some of the process, and we'll end up with this long form tasting note, and then I'll look to, excuse the pun, kind of distill that down into a shorter name of 2 or 3 words, and that's how we have got to butterscotch ice cream.
I noticed after I put the lineup together that they're all linked, kind of. So we've got butterscotch ice cream, we've got the ice cream shack, and we've got a buttery maple fudge. So it's all kind of in the same vein.
Yeah, sorry.
Some way or the other.
I sometimes end up with that happening. I got accused of having too many tasting notes that reference baked goods. I remember Master of Malt released one of our, I think it was a 4-year-old Clynelish called Capaccio Salsa Verde, and they said, in Wien's long continuing theme of salsa named whiskies. It turned out we'd named like 4 different whiskies based off of different types of salsa.
Right.
So yeah, it can happen, but we're just being creative. And at the end of the day, hey, if you don't like the name, the distillery's on the ball. You know, I've had people like that. Our Dutch importer is like, Stephen, I don't get these flowery, pretentious names. They have nothing to do with the whiskey. And then I went to him and I was like, Jock, what are these bottles here? He's like, oh, those are our bottles. They're all vintage cars.
Yeah.
I was like, well, what's that got to do with whiskey? At least we're trying to interpret the name, the taste and the aroma into the name. But hey, if you're not into it, you can take it or leave it.
Sure.
Talk about Strathmill. So,
there's a quick question again about the Kingsbarns in the chat. Why no use of sherry casks, or are there any plans for that in the future?
There are plans for sherry casks. We do have sherry cask maturation. We have arranged different sherry casks from kind of European oak, American oak. Actually, most sherry casks on the market are actually American oak, and they tend to be well-used American oak casks. We also have some ex-bodega casks, which are really interesting as well. You won't get that same kind of heavy, treacly intensity, but you get some other complex kind of tobacco-y, almost tobacco-like, cigar-like notes coming from it. So we do have them. They tend to be in butts, which are 500-litre casks, as opposed to barrels and hogsheads, which are 200 to 250 litres. So the maturation really should take a little bit longer. So we're giving it a few years longer, and I'll leave it at that. But just keep your eyes out. There is sherry cask out there, and they will be out at some point. They will likely be limited release rather than limited edition. So that's that. I differentiate that. A limited edition means it comes out once, and when it's gone, it's gone. to me, a limited release is that kind of yearly cycle. So if you get into the idea of distilleries releasing something once every year in November or whenever, that's the plan for the sherry cask.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Let's talk about the Strathmill. Are there any people wanting to share something about that? What do you think about the Strathmill? I like it. I think, but I usually like Strathmill whiskies. It's not that well known as a distillery or as a profile, but I love it actually. It's quite light, fruity stuff like that. Yeah,
It's indeed kind of fruity. I love it above the previous one, the the Kingsbarn. And indeed, you have a little bit of the butter in it.
Yep. So butter comes from a couple of different things. Firstly, it's something called diacetyl. Beer brewers might know about that as well. Diacetyl develops in fermentation, particularly in short fermentations. What happens is the diacetyl develops, and then if you have a long fermentation, it kind of gets reabsorbed again. So if you keep the fermentation fairly short, you will likely have these kind of notes that are described as buttery to kind of toffee to burnt sugar in range, and that tends to be that flavor of butterscotch. Now, the other thing that complements that very, very well is good active American oak casks, and this was a second fill cask. And for me, I mean, first fill, you get very intense vanilla, but when you get to second fill casks, you get a little bit more of a balance between the spirit and the wood, but you develop, again, these lovely kind of toffee, creamy kind of flavors. So there's just a marriage made in heaven here between Strathmill and the second fill bourbon cask. The other things really to keep with note of Strathmill, and sorry, this is where I get kind of geeky on stills, because I just love learning about them and how they influence spirit character. You'll see this is the Strathmill stills here. It's a set of 4 stills. So the ones on the right are the wash stills. So they're the first distillation. The slightly smaller stills will always be smaller, the spirit stills on the left-hand side. And you'll note this weird angled pipe that's coming down at a kind of 45-degree angle. And there's a better picture of it here. This is what's referred to in the industry as a purifier. They're not very common. There's only a handful of distilleries in Speyside that have them. I think Glen Spey has it, as well as a worm tub. Probably the most famous is Ardbeg, and that to me is where you really understand what a purifier does. If you look at every peated distillery, they are dry as well as smoky, because what they do is they cut quite late when they get the spirit, because they don't, if they want all the smoky character, that appears later in the distillation run. So when you cut late, you lose all the estery sweeter notes at the beginning. The exception's Ardbeg, because they've got that purifier, it enhances the reflux and you end up with that sweet note running all the way through the spirit. So really what you do with a purifier, it's no longer, well, some people still refer to it as reflux. We're getting into vague territory here, because is that still coming from the still? I mean, it's almost like the shell and tube condenser on the other side of the wall. But technically that's not a second or third distillation. That still counts as reflux within the still. And it's none of this funny 2.7 times distillation.
Yeah, 1.87 or 1.94, yeah.
Exactly. And what you'll see, I mean, that's a fairly straight, slightly lower tapered line arm there. The heavier vapors will go down that purifier and will be introduced back to the base of the still. So you'll end up with much more reflux. And when we learn in blending, a lot of blenders, they refer back to Diageo. Diageo, obviously a giant company with 27 distilleries. And really in terms of kind of modern blending, your kind of crash course or your foundations, you learn from Diageo in particular about how they build blends like Johnny Walker. And a Diageo blender, they have to be able to blind nose, so not even taste, it's all done by nose. They have to blind nose all 27 Diageo new make spirits, and they have to be able to tell straight away which ones they are. Now that seems like a very daunting task, but what they do is break it down into 6 subcategories. So you have grassy, nutty, oily, peppery, and smoky, and then sweet, I think. And that's the 6. So once you break those down, it becomes a bit easier. So for example, oily, there's only one, which is Clynelish. Peppery, there's only one, which is Talisker. when you get to grassy, there's only, I think, 4 or 5, but the first one they give you is Strathmill. Strathmill's the first whiskey they give you as an example, or just the new make as an example of what they call a grassy whiskey. It's grassy. It's got a lot of what we call aldehydes, which are anything from kind of cut grass up into floral or even vanilla notes in new make, which is quite, you think vanilla just comes from barrels, but actually you can get slight notes of vanilla coming from the aldehydes and the spirit as well. And Strathmill is a great example of that. So yeah, that's kind of emptying my brain.
Very cool.
Everything about Strathmill. It was a distillery that I maybe passed by quite a lot. You know, it doesn't have some really cool, well-known single malt brands. There's, I think, a 12-year-old Flora and Fauna release. I've come across.
Yeah, I think it's basically only made for blending and independent bottles.
Yeah, it's a good and I don't mean to knock it in any way. It's what we call a base malt. It's very good for building a nice rounded foundation. So that's typically what it'd be used for in blending. But it doesn't mean that you can't get very lovely, striking single casks, especially when it's married with the right type of cask.
Yeah, people are seeming to like it in the chat, loving the sweet taste, slightly salty note, maybe some salted caramel, somebody's saying, love the fruity aroma. So yeah, I think there's a couple of people speaking up in the chat, so I don't know if anybody else wants to say something about this, share some thoughts. I was looking through the catalog that Nectar offered for this tasting long time ago already, because I planned this in March, and I saw Strathmill 24-year-old, and I was like, yeah, that's going to be in the lineup, because
I think we had 2 of these, 2 sister casks. I just can't remember what the other one was, but yeah, the second fill bourbon, I remember them well. I wrote the tasting note for this, so yeah, getting blamed for the ice cream notes again.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's single cask. We're not, you know, first time I came to Belgium again for Spirits in the Sky that we're talking about, I went on the table and there was like 15 single casks and like 2 blended malts. And I was like, oh, that's weird, because 90% of our business is making blended malt, and we only bottle about 60 single casks a year. They said S&WS 500, Gordon MacPhail probably 600 plus. It's not the primary thing of our business, but I think for a lot of people, especially for kind of people who are really, really into their whiskey and obsess over single casks, that's probably where they first found out about Wemyss, is our single casks. And we still try and maintain that standard and have excellent releases, but we don't have access to a huge amount of them, and we're very kind of selective with what we bottle.
I think we're breaking. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I was just going to carry on waffling on, obviously, about the...
Yeah, but I was just going to say this is a good little bridge we're making to the next whiskey we're tasting, because we're going to have the Hive now, and that will allow us to get into what you were talking about, actually, about the core range of the blends that you make, which is, as you said, the main part of Wemyss, but maybe not as strangely not as well known for whiskey geeks like us. So
again, I think. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but what I find in particularly in the UK and in some markets like Germany, maybe not so much in Belgium, it's not a bigger deal in France, but it's the dirty word blend.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's still a dirty word to use.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, you know, historically, I think up until about 2008, when the SWA regulations changed, this category of drink was referred to as vatted malt. And people seem to be quite happy with that. But I'm not going to point any fingers, but a particular large company did some shenanigans with...
the evil empire, you mean?
I mean, they're there for what they do, and I've had great experiences with them. And
I can say it, you can't.
And I like their whiskies, but there was a little bit jiggery pokery in the mid-noughties where they had a single malt distillery that was doing very well in Spain. And they kind of were at the limits of how much of it they could produce. So they swapped the names around. They literally changed a U to an O at the end of this distillery, and basically started selling a vatted Speyside as the single malt name, and then the single malt name as the I'm getting confused, but they swapped them around, and the SWA kind of slapped them on the wrist for that. And then that's when the terminology changed. Now, that company would deny that's not the reason, and maybe there are other reasons. I'm maybe oversimplifying it. Yeah, so the term got changed from vatted to blended malt, and there are still some people refer to it as vatted. You can go back to talking about pure malt, but that gets even more complicated because with single malt brands, the very first kind of single malt of note marketed single malt was Glenfiddich Pure Malt. Single malt that is called pure malt, so terminology gets even more confusing. So the new categorization is blended malt, but the problem is with the word. I think people hear the word blend, and Bill Lumsden explained this much better than I did, but he thinks people almost psychologically think it means blending down. Blend equals dilution.
It's also the lower shelf in the supermarket.
Yeah, but then the thing is with single malt, with blended scotch, this is the other thing I hear. People are like, oh, blended malt, that's quite expensive for a blended malt. No, it doesn't matter which category. If you're in single malt, blended malt, or blended scotch, you have budget, you have premium, and you have super premium. And all three of those categories. And we try and position ourselves into the kind of premium. So we talk about kind of £40, €40 around that price point. And to reflect that, because we're doing small batch production, we're not producing 200,000 bottles at a time. Each time we make one of these, it's a run of maybe 9,000 bottles tops, and that's it. So it's very challenging to make a blend consistent in that small quantity. There's things that we do to ensure that. But then we bottle at 46%, we non-chill filter. They're what we call multi-regional blends. So there's other blended malt producers that blend by just one region, which is it's just their approach. They'll go for a whole Speyside or a whole Islay blend. What we like to do is see how those variations in those styles kind of interact from each other. So I'll pull up this. Can you still see my slideshow?
Yep.
Yes.
Boring Friday night looking through my slides, but it just helps with what I'm talking about. So this to me, and I've made this is my breakdown, and this isn't me saying this is the flavor that comes from these regions. It is what we request from those regions, or what we want from those regions. So lowlands, light, crisp, citrus, and grassy. I'm not saying every single lowland produces that. If you go down to Annandale, they do a light whiskey and a smoky whiskey. Inchy can be quite oily. It's what we want to fit with the recipes that we made. So this is our rough kind of idea. So when it comes to the Hive, what we do is we make a foundation, a base, and this is sat in a stainless steel tank 9 miles from me at Broxburn. And this is our foundation. I don't want to say a blank canvas because there is flavour there, but this is the canvas that we use to start our blends. And we start with lowland whiskey, and then from that triple distilled lowland, we will add some Central Highland whiskey. It's more of a kind of malty, cereal rich note. And then we'll layer in a few different types of Speysides, usually worm tub distilled Speysides because that gives us body. And that is our blank canvas. We are making Hive, Viking, Peat, Chimney. That is our starting point. Our French importer kind of noted it as our house character, that there's always kind of a zestiness, a cereal richness, and a slight kind of malty floral note there as well. And that comes from that kind of three regional combination to make the foundation of our blends. Now, then when it comes to Hive, we wanted it to be indicative. Back when it was first designed, they were talking about Speyside style. I've cut that chat because I don't believe in it. It's more to me, this is a light, fresh, fruity, sweet. And when you talk about sweetness, there's a scale of sweetness. You can go to very simplistic white sugar sweetness. You can build in depth and complexity into honey-like sweetness. Then you can kind of go really, really heavy and deep and get into kind of treacle, molasses,
Caramel,
that kind of stuff. So the objective with the Hive is to sit in the middle, a honey-like sweetness. We're not adding honey. It's not a liqueur. We're not adding tons of honey-flavored whiskies. What we're doing is we're adding lowland, Central Highland, and various different types of Speyside to get to a honey-like sweetness. That's the kind of key objective with this blend. We blended malt, sorry, should I say. Yeah, we want it to just be a lovely kind of, it's a good one to maybe if you've had whiskey a couple of times and then you want to kick it up a notch into something slightly higher ABV, really get into nice kind of florals and medium sweetness. It's a nice all-rounder, dare I say, a kind of sessionable whiskey that I really, really enjoy, and it's just a good introduction to the range and what we produce.
So this is like the flagship, the base, or is the whole? Could you consider the whole core range as your flagship?
We've talked about that before, and some of the sales team are keen to do that, to have this as the flagship, or they call it like a hero brand, because it's crowd pleasing. There's no sulfur, there's no smoke, there's nothing that's going to put anybody off. But I've kind of avoided that, because what I like about Wemyss is we're not producing one style at like 12 years old, 15 years old, 18 years old. We have that variety. We have those options, and those blended malts, Hive, Spice King, and Peat Chimney, the core range, they're all essentially at the right same price point.
Mm-hmm.
It's down to what you like. And I like asking people that, you know, do you have a sweet tooth? Do you eat really spicy food? Or are you more adventurous and eat anchovies and dark chocolate? And I try and figure out, you know, what is that person's kind of taste profile? And then hopefully we've got a whiskey to suit them. And that's the kind of thought process behind it.
I'm now thinking about how anchovies and dark chocolate would taste together. But
probably horrible.
Yeah, probably.
Don't try it, Jeroen.
No. It's something for in the weekend. I'll get some anchovies and some dark chocolate. But
I meant the kind of adventure.
Of course, I'm joking.
Yeah.
I also like that you, especially for today, you put your map into the Belgian colors. So it's the Belgian flag.
Yep, did that just for you guys.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
I'm all about the details.
There's some people in the chat going, it's quite spicy. Spice hint, some spiciness.
Yeah, so spice, and we'll talk about spice a lot in the next dram. To me, spice comes from quite a few different things. First, you can have spice developing from the fermentation, so those cereal notes. In particular, the Central Highland whiskey, you can develop, well, again, I won't get too heavily into the chemistry, but there is a terpene called pinene. And pine, obviously, you'll smell that in pine trees. But the thing, I think the edible thing that has the highest concentration of pinene in the world is clove. So if you get it in different concentrations, it'll give you this kind of clove-like spice.
It's, sorry, just translate that for the people. It's a kruidnagel for who doesn't understand what clove is. Yeah.
Fair enough. And then sulfurs. So not all sulfur is bad. There's been too many ill thought out, badly written articles about how sulfur destroys all whiskey. Sulfur starts in fermentation, and sulfur can lead to wonderful things. It can develop into spices. It can develop into peachy kind of rounded fruit flavors. It just needs time. Sulfur that comes from a cask, yes, that can be bad. Dimethyl sulfate, again, bad fermentation, that can be an off note. But standard sulfur compounds that develop in fermentation, they can lead into spice. Peat, certain peats, things like glycol and eugenol in the peat can give you a spice-like character. And then finally, alcohol, just the effervescence of alcohol, and bottling at 46%, that will give you some of that alcohol effervescence as well.
Maybe while we're talking about spiciness, you could also pour the next dram, which is the Spice King, I guess we're having now. So you can taste these next to each other to get the difference between the two drams, which might be nice.
What I'll do, and this was the original plan, and as Barry said, he came to one of my tastings last year in Belgium. I always like to do a blending workshop in my tastings and actually demonstrate the rough way of thinking and the rough approach to how we put a blend together. And we're not in a lab. We're not actually there with the casks pouring whole casks together. When we build a recipe, it's pretty much like this. We're in the boardroom, and we have, I mean, even that's too big. That's a 500 ml sample. When we're talking about cask samples, you usually only get 200 milliliters. And the thing with Wemyss is we have about 6,000 casks and none of our own warehousing. So we have casks warehoused all over Scotland. So for us to get those samples in itself is quite a logistical job. So we get these 200 ml samples to the office, and then we start what we call our tabletop or our lab blend, which is a scaled down blend where we work out the recipes. And then the idea is we'll take that recipe and we will scale it up once we get all those casks taken out of Bond and brought to Broxburn, just outside of Edinburgh. So what I'll do here is just a small scale blend to make Spice King, the whiskey that you have there. Now, I appreciate, obviously, this is on Zoom, so you're just watching someone pour liquid into other liquid. It'd be lovely to do this in person, and you get to nose it and taste it and see the differences. But I'll just kind of roughly explain through the process.
As long as you send us all a sample of it afterwards, it's perfectly fine.
I'm actually only making 50 mil.
Well.
I'm just gonna have a double tonight.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, the key things with blending, and I encourage people to try it at home. It can be quite good fun. A lot of people talk about an infinity bottle these days. So the idea of having a bottle, and when you've maybe got a couple of inches or 8-inch left in your single malt, you put it into the infinity bottle and you keep feeding it. And some people just use it. We call it a hogwash, as to use an Edinburgh term. So we have this glass vase in the office, and any leftovers, it goes into the hogwash. And that's got everything from 3-year-old single malt to 35-year-old grain whiskey in there, and it changes every week. But that's our kind of infinity bottle. So you could do it that approach, or some people get really into it and really think about everything that they put in. When it comes to a blender, you never have the opportunity to just be like, I'll just chuck loads of things together and see what happens. There's always an objective. The objective is to recreate the whiskey from the year before, or is to develop a whiskey that's set by the customer to have certain parameters. It has to be smoky, or it has to be rich, or blah, 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 blah. And there's also, just to be fairly unromantic about it, there are financial restrictions sometimes. You know, I would love to crack open 20-year-old single malts and use those all the time for blends, but you have to hit a certain price point with some of these products, and liquid cost is something you have to consider as well. That's sometimes, say, with you have a budget for your blend. If you want to have smokiness, that's going to be the most expensive part of your blends. You have to think about how much and at what age to offset the price of the other liquid. So there's a lot of things to consider. So I'd say when it comes to blending, obviously you don't have to get that technical, but just have a think. What's the outcome? Do you want a whiskey that tastes like chocolate and orange? Do you want a smoke bomb? You know, what do you want to try out? Do you want to see how Japanese whiskey interacts with bourbon whiskey? Set yourself an objective and then try and blend towards that goal, because that's what a blender does.
I'm looking at anchovies and dark chocolate.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I would say for that, you would want something like Glengarry has a nice malty base. So then you want to add some casks with a lot of nice first fill bourbon. That should get you to chocolate. And then let's go for like a Glen Scotia and just chuck that in there. And that would probably be getting somewhere to anchovies and chocolate.
That would actually work, because Glen Scotia is the only distillery I don't like at all. So that's... But I interrupted you. Go on with the spice.
Right, so I have my recipe here. I'm just doing a small scale blend because my total outcome is going to be 50 mil.
Steve, can you just stop sharing your screen then, so we can see the
we got
you in full video mode?
That's a very good point.
Can you Thanks, Sven.
Cool. Sorry, I didn't realize I was minimized there. So, first thing I'm starting with is this whiskey here. So, naming no names, I'm not disclosing any of these. We worked a secret recipe. You are welcome to guess. This is a triple distilled Lowland distillery.
I think it's the corner of the field.
Well, we'll leave it at that.
I also think that.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing here is I'm recreating our base. So this is 3 parts in equal quantities. So each make up a third of what we call the base. So this is the Lowland. I don't know why I'm putting it into a dram glass. That's not me off to a good start. 1 second. Here you go. This is my blending vessel, or what would be the equivalent would be the stainless steel tank at Broxburn. I'm making a very small blend for this giant vessel, but that'll do. So that's 16 mil of the triple distilled Lowlands. And then I have Central Highland whiskey. Fairly malty, cereal rich and note. We talk about something called furfurol, which gives you really deep, rich, malty kind of flavors, kind of gingery spice to it as well. There's no real fruit character in this. There's no ester profile at all. So I'm going to do equal amount again, 16 mil. And anyone who's been on my tasting, sorry if I repeat this again, but this to me is a crucial exercise to explain blending. So what I do now, I had the really pithy, sharp citrus notes of the Lowlands, and now I've introduced this Central Highland rich cereal note. And what we get to, and you'll just have to take my word for this, or I think Barry, is it Barry? He's sat away in the corner. He was at one of my tastings last year and hopefully got to smell this. The objective of putting those two together is to get to a flavor like orange. So I'm not saying it is orange, but we're deepening those citrus notes that were in the lowlands. Orange didn't exist independently in either of those whiskies. We can only achieve that flavor by blending. And that's all blending is. It's just A plus B equals C. We're not diluting down. We're not packing it out or lowering the quality. It's just thinking through the two ingredients and how they're going to influence each other. So by taking that lowland and that central highland, I'm getting to an orange-like flavor. And that's our thought process with blending. That's all it is. It's not a dirty word. It's nothing to be scared of. Now that I've got this lovely kind of orange flavor, I want to get some body into the blend. Now you've got Spice King hopefully in your glass. Give it a swirl in the glass. One of the objectives with Spice King is to make it a heavy-bodied whiskey. Now you'll see that by the legs that form on the side of the glass. You have two things when you look at the body. You've got the beading. So the finer the beading at the lip of the glass, so the beading up at the top, sorry, that doesn't work. But the finer the beading, the higher in alcohol. But when we look at body, we're looking at the legs. So the length of time it takes for those tendrils of liquid to form on the glass and how long they stay on the glass, that will infer the body of the whiskey. So the longer it takes, it's similar to wine, you know, it's just the thickness of the spirit. And the objective with Spice King is to make this lovely mouth-coating, oily feel, because that means it exists on your palate for longer, then all those spicy notes are going to stay. So that's the kind of objective and idea. So this Speyside whiskey, again, some people will think Speyside just means light and fruity or whatever. There's tons of different styles in Speyside. This is a worm tub distilled Speyside, and this is what we call a bodybuilder. It's oily, it's heavy, it's got sulfurs in it, and that's from this worm tub form of condensing the spirit back from vapor into water. If you see like photos of bootleg distillers, and you'll see that traditional coil, it's how all the lembic distilleries, it was the first form of recondensation of spirit back into alcohol. That's what's going to give you this lovely body. So again, equal amount, 16 mil, going in. Might be 17 mil, but hey, it's Friday. I'll let myself. Oh, what am I doing? I've just put it into my dram glass. Sorry, organization is the key. I never should have had that 9% beer. 16 mil.
You might be making new, undiscovered, perfect malts.
Potentially, I'll go back and check that one. Right.
Yeah.
So we have what is now what I refer to as our base malts, equal parts lowlands, central highlands, Speyside worm tub. So that base, as I said previously, we can use that to make the Hive, Spice King, Peat, Chimney. But what I'm now going to do is I'm going to add some what we refer to as backbone, and that is a little bit, a very, very dominant particular whiskey, and that's really going to drive it into a particular style and flavor. So it's just small quantities. It's only 10% of the total blend. I'm going to add 2 of these backbone whiskies. The first one is what I'll refer to as a waxy, oily Highland Northern whiskey. Again, I can't disclose the name of the distillery, but there are certain buzzwords that you say with whiskies.
There might be one coming next when we're tasting. Might be. Not sure.
So this is only 10% of the total blend that's going in. It's a tiny amount. And what this is going to do is it's going to help with the body again, because we've got that lovely waxiness. It's also a fairly dry whiskey. So it's quite good for kind of pulling back any overt sweetness if you want to keep it fairly neutral. And it's got a lovely kind of doughy and floral note in there. It's just a lovely complex whiskey. Blenders absolutely love this whiskey. And it started to get a fairly prominent cult following among single malt producers as well. So that's just going to help increase that body in the glass. Then the next thing I'm adding, and again, this is only 10%. Oops, I'm sure I got the right one. Is some heavily peated Islay whiskey. You can see it's very pale. Most Islay whiskey is put into refill casks. Why go through all the trouble and expense of peating whiskey to then use a cask that's going to filter it all out? So almost all Islay whiskey is in refill casks. It's only really stuff that's for single malt that they'll put into different types of cask. But we want that really intense, dry, smoky note. Also, this is the youngest component of the blend. This is 5 years old. The younger the Islay whiskey, the more pungent, the more smoky. So So when I was talking about budget earlier on, but also just about flavor creation and being efficient with the whiskies that you're using, if we use younger Islay, we can use less and still get that lovely intensity. And you got to be careful with Islay whiskey. If you go above 10%, it can really overwhelm the blend. I've seen a lot of people try and make their own blends, and then they put in like 20% Islay because they think they want a little bit of smoke. It just collapses the blend and overwhelms absolutely everything. So again, it's just 10% of the total going in. And you'll know if you go back to Spice King and give it a smell, there's a couple of different peat elements going on in there. Now, the peat that you're probably getting is from the final component that comes from the West Coast. What I'm doing here with under 10% or 10% of the blend, it's not about adding obvious smoke notes. A little bit of Islay, what we're going to do, that smoke, we're going to lengthen the whiskey. So when I talk about length, I talk about the length of time the flavor stays on your palate. You have a short whiskey, a medium length whiskey, and a long whiskey. Kingsbarns, Strathmill, we would say those are short whiskies. The flavor only exists in your palate for a couple of seconds. But when you add smoke, smoke flavors start coming almost from the back of the palate and they last longer. So we can actually design the length of time the flavor should exist on the palate, design the length of time it should take you to drink the whiskey based off of how much Islay we put in there. The other thing that little bit of Islay does is it's like an amplifier, kind of turns everything up to 11. So if you've got the kind of the orange, the florals, the sweetness, we'll dial those up a tiny bit. We'll just, boom, just a little bit of Islay expands those flavors.
It's a bit like pepper and salt in a meal.
Yeah, kind of. That's a good analogy to use. But you've got to be very, very careful. You can quite easily overwhelm the blend, and that's always the main thing we check on Spice King when we make it for the next batches, is that we haven't overcooked it on the Islay. And a good way of clawing that back, if we have, is to add some of that Highland Northern back in, just to try and pull it back. Now, final ingredient. This is what we refer to as our signature malt. Some people refer to them as top dressers or dressing malts in blends. You might see that term referred to. And these are whiskies that are really savoured in the industry for really defining the flavour of a whiskey. Now, the thing is, when we talk about most blenders, they are making blended Scotch, which is 80% grain whiskey, 20% malt whiskey. So their top dresser is actually still only a small fraction of the total blend. With Wemyss, with blended malt, it's usually a third. Could be a little bit more, but it's usually a whole third of the blend is this top dressing malt. And that's to really drive it into one of those three flavor profiles, sweet, spicy, or smoky. So to make this one the spicy kind of beast that we want, we are using a West Coast Highland Island worm tub distilled medium peated whiskey. And if you know any of those things together, there is only one thing.
You basically said everything besides the name.
So it's from the west coast of Scotland, Highland Island. So it's not from the mainland, it's from one of the islands. It's worm tub distilled. So if you look up how many worm tub distilled single malt distilleries that are on islands, that would narrow it down. And it's medium peated, which would narrow it down even further.
Mm-hmm.
But I will leave it at that. The reason I don't disclose them, it would be lovely to have full transparency like some companies do. We blend with some absolutely amazing stocks. Some of the best single malt, they're brands in their own right. They're very big, prominent brands in their own right. Our buying contracts are relatively new. We got them in the last 10, 15 years. And most companies with a new buying contract won't let you disclose the name. And if we start disclosing the name, we could actually risk being allowed to get that stock the next year. The other thing is also, as a blender, we don't always keep to the same liquid, the exact same single malt. So that might sound a bit bizarre, but to get to the same consistency, we sometimes have to swap. And because we're independent, we don't have a steady supply of all the stock. So an example I like to give, because it happens quite a lot, is that worm tub Speyside that I have. That's a very distinct single malt. And if I don't get that 1 year, I sometimes have to recreate that style, but use 3 other single malts. I'll take some Highland Northern, I'll take some Ben Nevis, I'll take another Speyside, pull it together and get to that similar single malt. But now I've got 3 component single malts, whereas I had 1 before. So we need that flexibility so we don't disclose the names. So those are the 2 kind of reasons. And it's one of the other frustrating questions to answer. I know people want an answer to, but I can't give, is people ask, well, how many single malts are in the blend? Well, because of that, because we swap and change every year, and because we keep an element of the liquid year to year to year to help with consistency, it changes. So there is no set exact amount, and that's, you got to kind of put your blending head on and put the single malt head away. That doesn't make sense, hat away. But yeah, it's just that difference. Anyway, I will finally finish this because you guys have been waiting, and really, yeah, so that final third is this West Coast Highland Island medium peated worm tub, and this equates to 1/3 of the final blends. And that, to me, that West Coast Highland Island, it's got a pepperiness, it's got a Highland smoke that isn't as medicinal as the Isla whiskey, but there is more of it. So the smoke notes that you're getting in Spice King are primarily coming from this element. And there is a maritime, I'm not going to say salty, but there is a maritime savory edge to it. And to me, that gives it its lovely salted caramel element to it. So the main things I want from Spice King, first couple of seconds, I want sweetness. Then you get this little twang of savory edge, and that's almost the midpoint of the whiskey. And then as soon as you get that savory twang, that's where all the spice notes start coming, and they kind of intertwine with the peat as well. But there's always a sweetness coming through, and that's the balance. So it's a very, very complex whiskey. It's the hardest of our 3 core range to make because you've got 5 different key components there. It's very, very tricky to keep it consistent year on year. But that's what I love about this whiskey, is its nuance. It's like the little hints of flavor that jump around.
It is really nice, yeah.
And it's not atypical of one style. Back 2005, 2010, our sales guys would have been, this is the Highland style. But there is no one Highland style. You know, start with Glenboyne, just north of Glasgow, and finish at Orkney with Highland Park and everything in between. There is no one Highland style. But this to me is just about being oily and that juxtaposition of sweet and salt and all those kind of peppery smoke.
The little touch of peatiness, smokiness in there, yeah.
Yeah. So that's Spice King.
One of the questions I wrote down beforehand was, and I think you can answer this one, is if you had your free reign and you had one single malt to base a blend on, which is the malt you most like working with?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There isn't like a go-to individual malt because you want to have variety in your blend. The Highland Northern Distillery, I mean, shit, I've kind of backed myself into a corner now if I name it, but Clynelish. Clynelish is a great way to blend with it. It just gives you intense body, and it gives you these lovely kind of bready notes. I love Craigellachie. Craigellachie by itself, you know, if you get young Craigellachie, it can almost taste like mezcal. It can be quite brutal.
It's pretty funky.
Yeah, but in a blend, you know, you can use that as an amplifier. It's almost like chucking ginger into your stir fry, and bring aromatics that are really interesting. And then there are just certain single malts that you're just not going to get for blending these days. I mean, Macallan was a top dressing whiskey. It was used for nothing but blending, really. I mean, there would be some fringe bottlings of single malt for like locals and the odd Italian importer up until the 70s, and then it just became this like giant brand. But it was not for blending. But try and get hold of Macallan. Well, you can get Macallan, you can get Highland Park, you can even get Glenfiddich and Balvenie. But what
pricey?
Well, they teaspoon it, or they say they teaspoon it. So they introduce a small amount of another single malt, and suddenly that Balvenie is called Claymore, or that Glenmorangie is called Burnside.
Or Whitlaw, that's Highland Park, I think.
Whitlaw or Hightail.
Yeah.
There's sometimes they will come up with 3 or 4 different names, and it'll just go to different customers. So yeah, there's all these weird kind of blenders stock. And sometimes it's bizarre because you'll see them bottled and it'll say single malt. And it's like, well, it can't be a single malt because it's a teaspoon malt. It's a blended malt. So yeah, there are these really desirable ones out there that I think would be fun to play around with. And I've done it at home, you know, but the difference with the blending with the single malts that you have at home is they're very wood forward, where blending stock is very spirit forward. You know, we tend to blend with refill stock because that's one way of keeping the spirit consistent. If you start blending with first fill bourbons and first fill sherries, your spirit variation starts to go out of whack.
Yeah, I can see. Yep.
you rely on spirit character. So if you were to start blending with your single malts at home, you can do it, but you're going to end up with a more heavily oaked, a more heavily wood influenced blend, and that's tricky for consistency. Doesn't really matter if you're at home and it's a one-off.
No.
Cool.
Anybody want to add something about the Spice King? What do you think about this? Somebody saying, I like the Spice King a lot with the levels, just like you explained.
Good. That's always the aim. I'm not too far off it with this one. It's maybe a little bit too smoky, but I would, like I said, I would maybe add a little bit more of the Highland Northern, maybe a little bit more of the Speyside to pull it back. But yeah, I love that variation in Spice King. It's my favorite of the three. I like making cocktails with it. I like making an old fashioned or a whiskey sour.
Oh yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
I do a whiskey sour with pink grapefruit juice instead of lemon.
All right.
On the egg white, demerara sugar and rock salt, and it kind of melts on top. And it says, it's a good whiskey sour.
I'm scratching out anchovies and dark chocolate and changing it for this. Yeah. Maybe on an entirely unrelated note with what we've been talking about, not related to any Northern Highland distillery you've been talking about, but the next dram we're having is the Clynelish. So this is the special one that the guys from Friends of the Quaich added to the tasting because you are all so nice. They wanted you to have an 8th dram. I know that Stephen doesn't have this one, so he can't taste with us. So right back at you for not sharing that Spice King blend with us. Now you can't have the Clynelish.
Yeah.
But that's fine. I mean, we can.
Friends of the Quaich is a specialty club, so I absolutely wanted to add this one, despite the fact that some of our members already tasted it. But nevertheless, just enjoy it.
Tell me again, Barry, what was the name of the? This is a 1997 Clynelish, 46%. What was the name of it again? Something with cacao beans.
It's a 1997 Clynelish, and it was the cacao bean or something. I will show you the bottle in a minute.
Sure.
Yeah. One thing I'd be very interested, because this was bottled before I started with the company. Now, right, cool. Barry, could I ask, is there much liquid left in that bottle, or is it pretty much empty?
I arrange a sample for you.
Yeah, I have some samples still left at home, and we will send you one, Stephen.
That's not what I'm asking.
No, we will send you one.
No, that's not why I'm asking though, because the thing with Clynelish is Clynelish, Kalila, they are distilleries that are well known for amazing consistency. You don't get a lot of spirit variation from year to year. The only time I see major variation with Clynelish is when you're in something called a rancio cask. And that's where the cask is in pretty poor nick, and it essentially over-oxidizes. So it's not just wood. Oxygen can influence the color of spirit. Look at sherry, for example. Sherry wine, the color doesn't come from wood, it comes from the oxidization. So you see this kind of dark browning. This is a refilled bourbon cask.
I'll just pin Barry, so it's there. You go.
This is a 4th fill or a 3rd fill bourbon cask. It shouldn't have that kind of color. So that color is likely coming from a rancio cask. And I know that because the batch of 1997s that we have, over 50% of those casks are rancio casks. Could I also, Barry, could you tell me what the ABV is? Is it exactly 46% or is it below 46%? Does anybody have that information?
It's 46 normally, I think.
I'm on 46. So that makes it harder to tell. So rancio casks, the 2 usual tells is an unusual dark color given the cask type and also a low ABV. Now, because this has been fixed at 46%, it's hard to tell. Maybe it's 47, maybe it's 48, maybe it's 58. It's hard to know. But I suspect it might be a rancio cask. So you'll have the Clynelish waxiness, the Clynelish florals. But what you get with a rancio cask is you develop these overripe notes. It could be overripe fruit, and it can actually push all the way into things like truffle, like dirty kind of earthy notes or chocolatey notes. So it potentially is a rancio cask, which makes it a very unusual Clynelish. Unfortunately, I just don't know because I don't have it in front of me, so I'm kind of theorizing to a certain extent. But I know that a lot of Clynelish casks that we had, and a decent whack of them were a sister cask of that particular bottling I released this year. as part of our cask club, Wemyss Malts cask club, and it's called Tropical Scented Candles. And that was a Rancio cask as well. So really, if you want to learn about Rancio casks, Dave Broom did a lot of work on it. And if you go on scotchwhisky.com, Rancio, he has a lot of information. And it's one of these weird nuggets of bizarre things you come across with whiskey. And it's particular distilleries. It tends to be United Distillers, which is what is now Diageo. So it tends to be mid-90s, early 90s to mid-90s stock. I've seen it in Bladnoch, I've seen it in Clynelish, I've seen it in Longmorn, I've seen it in Linkwood. Very, very unusual flavor profile. Does anyone know how Clynelish gets its waxiness?
No.
I can tell you if you want.
Yeah, but please.
And I've got this from Diageo blenders, people who work with the spirit. So this isn't a passed on story from another ambassador from somebody else. This is like well researched. They're basically filthy buggers. They don't clean it. So you have in most distillery setups in a balanced distillation setup, you have your wash still, you have your spirit still. You don't transfer directly into stills. You have what's called a low wines receiver, which is a storage tank that holds the wash distillate at 22%. It then goes into the spirit still. That low wines receiver should be cleaned. It should be cleaned every couple of weeks, maybe every month. But Clynelish, they just didn't clean it. They wouldn't clean it at all. And in that wash still, that first distillate, you're basically distilling beer. So there's a huge amount of bits, there's little bits left from the fermentation that are coming through into that still. It's going to burn, it's going to give off oils. And what happens is in that low wines receiver is it actually builds up a residual scum, oiliness in the low wines receiver that is then passed on into the spirit still and is redistilled. And that's what helps produce that body. Now, Clynelish now do clean that low wines receiver, but they empty the tank first. They clean it, and then they dump it all back in again. It's kind of like giving your toilet a really good scrub and then going for a shit afterwards. Weird kind of way of going about things. But it gives you this really interesting character. Now, Diageo have tried to recreate it in other distilleries. There's a not well-known distillery that's one of my favorites called Dalhousie. And they're trying to get it to that same kind of body so that it can take some of the stress off of Clynelish because it's so highly desired for blending. But they've not got there yet. So that's why Clynelish is just this really unusual setup. And I could pull up the slides if you want, but it's okay. If you look at the distillery, it's a workhorse distillery.
It's here.
Oh, yeah, there we go. It's not particularly attractive. It's got what we call the car showroom. So in the 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, United Distillers basically knocked down the still rooms in certain distilleries and built this glass front kind of 70s industrial front. Clynelish has it as well, unfortunately, but Clynelish is still beautiful just because of its location. But yeah, it's a workhorse distillery, again, for blending. It's the old Brora distillery. But it's just because of that unusual trait. It's nothing to do with worm tubs or condensation. It's to do with that low wines receiver, and that's what gives you that lovely waxy character. And again, you swirl it in the glass if you've got any left, and it's that body that's really, really distinct with it. So it's one of the few distilleries where you get body without sulfur, and that's the unusualness of that spirit.
I think one of the next Clynelishes you bottle, you should name it Residual Scum.
Residual scum.
That's a nice little phrase you use there. Residual Scum. That sounds like a good name for a malt.
I'll give that one to SMWS if they can sell skunk flavored roadkill.
Yeah.
Whiskey flavored condom and skunk flavored roadkill. They can sell.
Residual Scum. Why not? Yeah.
Sounds like a high school band. Hey
Yeah.
guys, Residual Scum. 1, 2, 3.
20 minutes later, it's over. Yeah. I'm seeing in the chat here that people are loving this Clynelish. Even the guys that are not yet members of Friends of the Quaich are really thankful for sharing this, guys. So I am too, actually, because I like this a lot too.
I'll tell you what, I'll have a little bit of my Highland Northern liquids. So
which is completely different. Which is a completely different, non-related dram. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, and I will make sure that I can send one of the extra samples we have to you.
Honestly,
it's one for you.
don't have to. I was wanting to know about the liquid in the bottle, but hey, if you want to, I'm not going to stop you.
Let's go on because it's 10:15 already. We're
Yeah, sorry. As I say, I walked on.
I mean, for me, it feels like 8:30, but it's perfect for me. But the next one we're having is the Bunnahabhain.
Yes.
So we're having the Ice Cream Shack, the 1990 26-year-old Bunnahabhain, bottled in 2017, 306 bottles. And here the little tasting note says, a seaside shack built from hogshead staves, sells lemon sherbet ice cream and salt toffee popcorn.
So that's one of the first that I wrote.
Is it?
Yeah, for the company. I remember that one. So I don't have that particular whiskey. I do have a sister cask, 1990 Bunnahabhain. This one's called the Gentle Giant. It's not as wood forward. It doesn't have as heavy a wood influence, but I'm drinking a sister cask from the same distillery and the same vintage. I don't think it's from the same parcel. The thing, I find Bunnahabhain really interesting. It's one of these accidentally interesting distilleries. You know, people talk about Islay, they'll expect smoke, but Bunnahabhain typically is unpeated. Now they do peat for a couple of months of the year.
Yeah, the Stauchas.
Well, it can be called. Throw me with Stoucher. I've never heard that one.
The really young ones now are all called Stauchas. Staois, something like that.
When I first started to get them, they were called Diabanic. Shabonic. I'm probably butchering the Gaelic way of saying it. But a good friend of mine, Olivia Fagan, who used to be on the tasting panels at SMWS, he's now a blender for InBev. So they work with Bunnahabhain as one of their distilleries. And I just called him up because we have on our spreadsheets in warehousing, we have like 4 different types of Bunnahabhain for blending stock. And I was like, what's the difference with all of these? And he's like, they're all the same. They're all heavily peated Bunnahabhain. We just change the names depending on which customer we give them to. So it's just this thing with blending stock. So about 20% of their production a year now, which is the largest amount it's ever been, is peated. And that's primarily for blending. And that's for a blend called Black Bottle. Now, Black Bottle, back in the 70s and early 80s, it used to get its peated spirit from the Eastern Highlands, from distilleries like Glenvore. But Eastern Highland distilleries have been gutted. There's none left. There's Glengarry, and that's it. We lost a lot of them in 1983 and a lot in 1992, 93 as well. I don't think there's very many. Ardmore sometimes gets counted, but it's not really one.
Is there a Fettercairn? Is that one of them?
Fettercairn's referred more to as a Central Highland. We're talking really coastal ones that actually used to run peat in their spirit as well, run peat as peated barley. So there was suddenly a lack of peated spirit to make Black Bottle. So that's where Bunnahabhain picked up the slack and they started doing peated runs. So you can find, I found peated Bunnahabhain as early as 1993, but really it doesn't really come into prominence until the noughties. So most Bunnahabhain is unpeated, and that's what we've got. I can say with confidence, that's what you've got in your glass there is unpeated Bunnahabhain.
It is,
The thing that makes Bunnahabhain unusual is just that it wasn't really, to say it's poorly managed seems unfair, but it wasn't really focused. It was inconsistent. You had Highland distillers, you had Edrington, had a lot of different owners, and it meant that the cask policy was really varied. So you've almost accidentally got this wide variety of Bunnahabhain. You've got unpeated, you've got heavily peated. You've sometimes got Bunnahabhain that's been put in a cask that had Islay whiskey in it before. So you've got a smoke influence, but that's coming from the cask. You can have accidents where peated barley has turned up at Bunnahabhain. There's this strange variety in the liquor that, you know, where Bruichladdich are purposely experimental, Bunnahabhain are kind of accidentally experimental. So you get a huge variety. And then you get weird things going on where I've seen, we bottled a 30-year-old Bunnahabhain that was 63.5% at cask strength, which meant that it was filled into the cask at around 70. And when I asked distillers, how's that possible? They just go, oh, the pipes were frozen. So when they're filling the cask, they're supposed to dilute it to 63.5%, but the water source was frozen or they had a drought or whatever. So they couldn't dilute the casks. So they end up introducing really high strength spirit into the casks, so you get this super intense whiskey. There's just so much variety with Bunnahabhain, and independent bottlers. S&WS are well known for their Glen Murrays. Gordon MacPhail are well known to say their Glen Grants or their Glenlivet.
Macallan's.
Well, okay, they're known for a lot.
Yeah.
We are very well known for our Bunnahabhains. We have a lot of them, and I don't mind that because there is no one Bunnahabhain style. There's a vast variety, and this to me fits in that kind of comfy chair, dare I say, breakfast whiskey. Put it on your porridge. It's porridgey, it's creamy, it's vanilla. There's only maritime hints. If you were to taste this blind, and all honesty, if you were to taste this blind, how many of you would think of this as an Islay whiskey?
No. Somebody in the chat is saying Campbelltown, so I can sort of get that.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason for that is the body, and that comes down to the still size and shape. The stills at Bunnahabhain are what you call bell stills. They're very fat and wide, and if you were to look at Glen Scotia stills, they're almost identical. And what that means is there's very little opportunity for reflux, whereas when we were talking about Strathmill with the bulb and the purifier, Bunnahabhain stills are the complete opposite. They're fat, they're wide, so what goes up doesn't come back down again. So that means all the heavier alcohols, all the oiliness, all the body, that is transferred. It's not a worm tub, surprisingly, it's a shell and tube. And Bunnahabhain, when they cut very early, which should have been quite a light, delicate spirit if we take Kingsbarns for an example. But somehow, even though they cut early, we end up with this kind of oily, creamy,
fatty,
kind of flavor. Yeah. Again, absolutely beautiful spirit. I love Bunnahabhains, and often overlooked on Islay because it doesn't have the peaty punch, although these days there are a few limited editions that do. But I just love its mellowness. Mellow, laid back, easygoing whiskey.
Yeah, again, when I was putting the lineup together a long time ago, I knew Bunnahabhain by Wemyss would have to be in the lineup, and then I saw this beautiful 26-year-old. I was like, yeah, it's quite at a good price too. I mean, it's for a 26-year-old whiskey. This is pretty good. Yeah.
Well, I'll say watch this space. As we have a lot of Bunnahabhain's casks, I've kind of decided to do something with them. I can't talk a lot about it yet, but in the next couple of months. Again, it's frustrating. I wanted all this stuff out in September, but because of what shall not be named, we've had to push our releases back a little bit. But I'm going to have some unusual Bunnahabhain releases coming out soon.
Nice.
An amazing price point.
And they will be in Belgium, on the Belgian market.
Absolutely certain, given the price point. I mean, I bet Ren's turns up as soon as...
I don't know if Ren's is here, but I'll check.
Given the price point, I can't imagine they're going to say no.
He's not here.
But yeah, our Bunnahabhains, we've got great single casks, and I'm looking to do a lot with them in terms of other releases as well. It's one of my favorite distilleries. And actually, the really cool thing with our Bunnahabhains is they actually come from the warehousing at Bunnahabhain. So most casks, people like to talk about how casks develop the character of the distillery. In reality, most casks are matured in the central belt of Scotland. It's a logistical thing, it's a storage thing. Your Laphroaig casks, whatever your Lagavulin casks, they are shipped over and they are in the Black Range of Scotland. They are in Leven in Scotland. You can Google these things and see these giant expanses of warehouse. So this argument that they're picking up local terroir.
So, but this is a real maritime one.
Well, again, I don't hold a lot of credence to that. But say John Campbell, the distillery manager at Laphroaig, who knows probably 10 times more than I do, if he can taste the difference between a Laphroaig that's been matured on Islay versus a Laphroaig that's been matured on the mainland, and good, he should know that. I couldn't say I would know the exact difference between a Bunnahabhain matured on the mainland versus on Islay, but I just think it's a really cool thing that it's come from Islay. Yeah. If you see the picture behind your back, well, on your screen, that's warehouse number 1 at Bunnahabhain. That's gone. They demolished it early last year. So that's one of the reasons why we are suddenly bottling a lot of Bunnahabhain.
You had to empty them.
They've knocked it down, and I think they're going to turn it into a visitor centre space. Which is a shame to lose old Dunwich warehousing like that, because there's not a lot of it. But hey, it's what they're planning on doing.
Well, it is a shame, but they also deserved a really nice space to invite visitors, because when I was there, I think it was 2014, it was just basically an office.
Still is. I was there for the Feshiel last year, and you've got giant queues because people are cramming into an office shop, and they're doing some really cool stuff now, where you get like just single casks that are only available at the distillery, little 20 CLs. The one of the few distilleries that will sell their new make as well. They're doing a lot of really cool stuff at Bunnahabhain.
Mm-hmm. People are liking it in the chat. I'm seeing. It's like having the best bowl of cereals ever in liquid form. Somebody's saying so.
Well, I'm trying to cast my mind back, but it's a few years now. But the main thing I remember with that particular whiskey is there is a kind of astringent woodiness, but there's also lots of different vanillins. There's lots of different creamy vanilla notes going on as well. So I came up with that name because it reminded me of a particular old rickety ice cream kiosk from where I grew up on the beach.
This is basically a childhood memory.
Yeah, you talk about your limbic system, how it triggers
smell
and taste, and that is genuinely one of them. I'm not saying every single whiskey does that it gives you this trigger to your memory, but certain ones definitely do. The one that did that for me the most, and why it's still my favourite Scotch single malt distillery, is Clynelish. The time I tasted and smelt Clynelish, it reminded me of the slate mines in Cumbria where I grew up, and I used to go with my dad after hours and acquire slate in not a legal manner, shall we say. And just the smell of that cut slate in the quarry mines, as soon as I smelled Clynelish, it just took me back to that.
It's funny how because one of the things I usually talk about when I host tastings is the smell of vanilla. For me, I never smell vanilla. I smell the wax that my grandma used for her furniture, and if I smell that, I know it's vanilla.
Well, maybe that established that benchmark, because there are scientific kind of rationales behind the limbic system, and the idea is that it's a trait that's developed through evolution. So if you were a hunter-gatherer and you were picking mushrooms or berries and you tasted something that poisoned and really hurt you, then there is a stronger memory established by the limbic system not to eat that red mushroom or eat that blueberry. Sorry, you're holding up a book.
Yeah, I was holding up. I just got this book. I haven't even read it yet, but it doesn't show up because of the background. But it's called What the Nose Knows. It's called The Science of Scent in Everyday Life. So I'm pretty curious about this. It's all about the psychology of scent and how the nose works and stuff like that. So as soon as I finished my other book, I'm reading this.
That's right up my alley, and that's why I try and learn about perfume making as well, because there's a lot of crossover between perfume making and I mean, you're dealing with distillates as well, but in terms of flavor formation, and we talk about triangular flavors, so rather than just a simple linear path of flavor, so maybe we go from vanilla into caramel, maybe make it triangular, so you go vanilla into ginger, then into caramel.
Oh yeah.
You develop a triangular flavor or triangular aroma. That's a principle that's taken from perfume makers. So there's a lot of crossover there, and it's good to learn these things.
Yeah, very cool. Then the next dram we're having is the Invergordon. While we're talking, because we don't have any structure left, but let's go on to the Invergordon. And I'm putting the title and the author of the book into the chat right now for the people who are asking about that. So
great.
And as soon as I've read it, you can borrow it from me if you want.
Send it with the Clynelish.
Oh well, it won't be that quickly finished. I've got a 700-page book waiting right now before that. So
right, Invergordon. As I said earlier, G5, in my mind, it will forever be known as G5. If any of you buy whiskey from whiskey auctions, if you find any S&WS bottlings, I should be talking about Wemyss, sorry, but I'm a whiskey geek. G5.2 to G5.9, if you come across any of those bottlings, you're dealing with virgin oak Invergordon, and it is nectar of the gods. Admittedly, it is dumb fun, because you're dealing with extreme wood influence and grain spirit, but it's absolutely superb. And the closest thing I've ever come to it again is our sherry cask releases of Invergordon. because it's quite unusual. Again, to most grain whiskey goes into refill casks because it's a bulking agent for blends. You know, a blend is 80% grain usually, and some of the blenders, retired blenders that I've worked with, the likes of Norman Matheson. Norman Matheson actually used to work. This company used to just be called Invergordon. It was its own independent company, and then it was acquired by White and Mackay. Yeah, I mean, you can try and find photos of it.
No, there's no photo. This is the best photo I found of Invergordon.
And I don't even know what that is. Is that the ventilation?
I don't know either, but this is just it's the best I found.
I've never seen an internal photo, and actually you'll see some photos outside, and one of the things you'll see is a White Mackay saying no tours.
Yep.
And grain distilleries, famously, you don't get tours. These are workhorse distilleries. I actually live right next to North British Distillery, and it's a big, huge complex with some old buildings, a lot of new buildings. And if you're ever in Edinburgh and you smell a kind of yeasty, bready, cereal note in the air, a lot of Edinburghers, a lot of local Edinburgh people wrongly assume that's from a beer brewery, Caledonian Brewery. It's not, it's from North British Grain Distillery. And what they have is they have a mash filter. So when you're making grain whiskey, you refer to it as single grain because it comes from one site, but actually it's multiple cereal types. In Scotland, it tends to be bulk wheat, then maize, corn, and you have to have barley. Barley has enzymes within it that basically help break down the sugars, the starch in the mash into fermentable sugars. So there is always some barley in a grain whiskey as well. So single grain doesn't refer to the fact it's one grain. It refers to the fact that it's from one site. But yeah, they're very pungent, smelly things. And really, the primary difference with grain whiskey, well, there's several differences. You've got that mixture of cereals, but it's the distillation type as well. We're not dealing with alembics, copper pot distilleries. We're dealing with continuous distillation. So
column stills.
Yeah, column stills. There's two columns typically, an analyzer and a rectifier, and basically there's plates in between. And what you want to do is you need to get to something called equilibrium, and that's where there is as much vapor passing up through evaporation as there is liquid recondensing coming back down, and that's called equilibrium. And that is basically you switch on the still and you just keep going. As long as you keep feeding that wash, and these things, they aren't using little mills, they're using big hammer mills to break up the cereal, and then they're using mash filters. There's no mash tun. Think of the walls in Indiana Jones that keep closing in. They've got these mash filters that are squeezing all of the moisture out of the mash. It's really efficient. Some distilleries, single malt distilleries, have them like Clynelish and Invergordon, but that's what they're using. And then you have this distillation. Now, saying, you know, it's a very industrial process. It's very ugly looking, big column stills and all that. Not vodka, not completely flavorless. We have what's called grain neutral spirit, GNS, that's used to make vodka and gin, and that is roughly 95.5% in alcohol. So a tiny, tiny amount of congeners left, flavor, and a tiny amount of water. The difference between grain neutral spirit and grain whiskey spirit is one ABV in alcohol. It's 94.5, but in that one ABV of alcohol is where a huge amount of the congeners exist. You actually, if you want to get to grain neutral spirit, you have to do something much more complex. It's called hydroselective analyzation, and it's much too late on a Friday night to get into that. But that's the difference between grain spirit and...
I don't know, Stephen. We told them it would last 7 hours, so...
Yeah, well, we can start talking about fusel oils and hydroselective analyzation.
I think that's for a different time. Yeah.
It just means another set. Basically, you dilute it and then redistill it again, just to pull out that final ABV to get you as close to a flavorless liquid as possible. That's not what we're doing. We're still, although it's 94.5, you might think, God, what's the point? There is actually still a lot of flavor. And if you were to taste the new makes of the 7 primary grain distilleries in Scotland, you would pick out distinct notes. North British is much more sulfury. And the key for me for Invergordon is it has this kind of sweet popcorny note. It has a popcorn-like sweetness. And then when you put it in a really amazing cask, be it virgin oak, like those SMWS bottlings I was talking about, or be it good sherry cask, you get this lovely it's a really extreme. You know, it starts very, very sweet for the first couple of seconds, and then the tannins and the high ABV strip all the sweetness out, and then it becomes this lovely dry candy note. It's almost like, don't you ever had Pez sweets, these candy corn sweets that you get in America, and they got a little plastic cartoon head on them. If you taste those, they're sweet and then suddenly really astringent. I get the same with Invergordon, and I love this distillery. It's one of my favorites. And grain, I mean, used to say 5 years ago, nobody talks about grain, nobody says grain's good, but I think we're past that. Everyone knows grain's good. And
I think the word is out.
Yeah, and it's great bang for your buck. They're usually at least a third the price of the equivalent.
Yeah, I think
the malt.
Just as for this one, I mean, it's a 1988 bottled in. It's a 30-year-old, and you can buy this bottle for 140 euros. I mean, that's just, if you compare that to single malt whiskey, 30-year-old single malt whiskey. I had a tasting yesterday with Highland Park, a professional tasting, of course, in the morning, and it was a Highland Park 25-year-old, but they're asking 550 euros for that. So
was that an official Highland Park? Or
the official bottling. Yeah,
I mean, even the independent bottlings are getting up there as well, because they know what to charge for them.
Sure, yeah,
and even with not only Invergordon but all the single grains, if you go for the older ones or distilled in the 60s or something, you pay a lot less than if you buy a single malt. They are even affordable to buy that old.
And a lot of that's not just to do with reputation and what price point you can sell a grain at. It's a more cost-effective spirit to produce. You know, it's distilled at a higher ABV. So then when you dilute it down to that 63.5, that magic filling strength, you've essentially got more bulk products. So it is a cheaper product. It should never be the same price as an equivalent single malt. But it doesn't mean that it's not tasty. It doesn't have its own things going on. Me and Invergordon, it's that big shift. It's that it tends sweet and then that drying note. I love it. I think it's really, really cool. And that's what I enjoy with it.
Yeah. I must say for the younger single grains, let's say younger than 10, 15 years, mostly I don't like them.
Well, they
have too much alcohol taste in them. But if you go older than 15 years, I really, really like them.
Yeah, Sven, you hit the nail on the head there. They need good wood influence. Now, those G5s at SMWS, they were 19 years old, I think. And they were experiments that Bill Lumsden did, because there's things called like the Artisan cask and Glenmorangie Astar, which were their first virgin oak Glenmorangies. Now, they wanted to know what the influence of virgin oak would be on Scottish spirit, but they didn't want to risk it too much. And the easiest way to do that was to get Invergordon. Geographically, Invergordon is very close to Glenmorangie. I did 2 weeks work experience at Glenmorangie, and a lot of the staff, so at Glenmore, you call it dead man shoes. So you start in the warehouse rolling barrels, and then when somebody in the washroom dies and you're good enough or you've been there long enough, then you end up in the washroom. And then when the still man dies, then you end up in the still room, dead man shoes. But actually, before you go to the cask, before you work in the warehouses, most of those boys came from Invergordon. So first, if you are a Highland Chukta, as we'll call it, a guy from up north near Tain, you probably worked at Nig. Nig is the port town nearest Glenmorangie and Invergordon, and you'd be working on the trawlers or something like that. And if you were lucky enough, you'll get a job at Invergordon Distillery. Then if you're lucky enough at Invergordon Distillery, you'll get a job at either Glenmorangie or Dalmore. And that's the kind of career path for the local boys who want to get into whiskey up there. I can't remember what my point was now, but
I'll bring it back a bit, because people in the chat are really loving this. Favorite tonight, my favorite too, my first grain ever, even somebody. So that's cool. Having somebody and further on, nose evolves so quickly. Glue, pencil savings, brown sugar. Love this. Pancakes with brown sugar.
that pencil shavings, that's that astringency I'm talking about. And the astringency just isn't from wood, it's from the ethanols, it's from the alcohol character as well. It's this really unusual flavor that develops, I think only develops in grain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a second person that has his first grain whiskey ever. So really happy with that actually. So
Yeah, stunning stuff. Absolutely love it.
Yeah, and when I said the young ones are too alcoholic,
That's what it
it's
was.
not all the young ones. I even had the 3-year-old that was very great, but mostly, let's say 80-90% of the young single grains, for myself, I find them too alcoholic.
Well,
I prefer them older than 50 years.
Yeah, this is something that I wanted to do, and I've pitched it, but no one's ever taken me up on it. And then Brewdog did it, and they only did a limited run, and they called it Ral Duke. They named it after Hunter S. Thompson, which I thought naming a whiskey after a famed alcoholic who then killed himself was a bit on the nose.
quite not that tasteful.
Yeah, but they did. It's Brewdog, but they did a 3-year-old grain whiskey, and it was matured just in virgin oak. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to try out young grain in virgin oak, because that shift, I want to push that shift as much as possible in the flavor. And I think if you got 10-year or younger grain whiskey, especially Invergordon, in very intense American oak or even sherry butt casks, I think you'd have a really cool whiskey there.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting back to, and this is not shameless promotion, but actually it is, because the single grain whiskey tasting we're having at the festival, the 3 single grains we're having by Braakman, the Belgian distiller, will be 10-year-olds.
I was going to ask about Belgian grain whiskey. You mentioned that right at the beginning of the
they're actually Geneva distillers, but they make grain whiskies now. But they have. Sorry.
Is it made in a pot still, or is it made in?
Well, I'm actually not that sure. I have to check with them, but the whiskeys we're having there is just the normal single grain. Then we'll have an Oloroso single cask and a PX single cask. So I'm pretty curious about those 3, and they're compared to a 15-year-old. I think it's a Port Dundas, and then 2 30-year-olds, and then the 40-year-old is a Cameron Bridge, I think. I'm not sure which ones they are, but
the hard thing is the definition of grain, because it changes. Grain in Scotland means something completely different to grain in Ireland. In fact, it wouldn't even be called grain; it'd be called malt. In Scotland, if I have a copper pot still, and I just put a different cereal in there, it automatically has to be called a grain whiskey. But it's completely different in style to these giant industrial Cameron Bridge, Invergordon, North British, Strathclyde, these big grain distilleries. It just there's not really much terminology to fit that. I think it was our Beaky produced last year a rye whiskey, and I think its official designation is a grain. It's a single grain, because they just use that different cereal, but it's made in a copper pot. So it's no way. It doesn't give you enough detail to really explain what it is. And it's just the terminology of Scotch whiskey. It's not caught up to the innovation of what's going on in the last couple of years. It'd be interesting to know what those Belgian grains are like.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, Sven has put up my own lineup for the tasting into the chat, so thank you, Sven. And actually, we have also an Invergordon 1988 30-year-old in there, so that'd be nice to compare. And then we actually start with the single grain Genever, then we'll have the single grain single barrel 10-year-old, and then we'll have the single grain with the Oloroso finish. Those are the 3 ones that we'll have from Braakman. So
Douglas Lang do some good bottlings, and those grains are good as well. I don't think their Invergordons are as good as mine though.
Let's go over to the 8th whiskey of the evening, the last one, and also without any of us noticing, but the Invergordon was a 55% ABV one, and now we're finishing the evening with the batch strength Peat Chimney at 57%. So enjoy.
This is another one I can't join you with, unfortunately. I cycled to my office this morning, and we didn't have any open bottles, and we usually keep the office well lubricated, shall we say, with stock of whiskey. But since it's been empty for the last 6 months, there weren't any bottles. But I helped make this blend along with Isabella Weems and some consultants who helped us with the stock. So I know it fairly well. This is batch 2, I assume.
It's batch 1.
Oh, it's batch 1. Excuse me. Well, I've worked on this one as well.
Yeah.
So 58% in alcohol.
57.
That's batch 2, is it not?
It says batch 1 on the bottle, so
Oh, I'm getting them mixed up.
it should be 6,000 bottles. Yeah, batch 1. It says so.
Could you hold up the bottle, Joan, if that's okay?
Yeah, I'm just because I've got another screen up here.
Yeah, that's batch 1. Okay,
Yeah.
right. Fine. I thought it was batch 2. Right. Well, that's fine. I still know this one. So I suppose the first couple of things to clear out of the way is we kind of shot ourselves in the foot by trying to give too much information, and we refer to these as batch strength. And people are like, "What the hell's batch strength?" Don't know what it's not officially a term that's recognised by the SWA. We took some advice from Ian McLeod. You'll know Ian McLeod if you drink Tamdhu, if you drink Glengoyne. They own 2 distilleries. They also do a lot of blended whiskies as well. And they released Tamdhu batch strength, which I think they're on like the 4th or 5th version this year. It's just going strength to strength. Now, you have officially cash strength and nothing else. And really, all cash strength means is natural strength. You cannot add any water whatsoever. If I have 100,000 litre vat and add 1 drop of water, it can't be called cash strength. That's it. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of jiggery-pokery in the industry where distilleries are releasing high strength products, but they're not cask strength.
Mm-hmm.
And all they do is they just don't mention it. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It is what it is. A best example I use commonly, because most people know it and have it in their house, is Ardbeg. So you will have the official Ardbeg at 46%. Then you'll have Ardbeg Corrie Vrecken, Ardbeg Ugadel. And when I'm in a tasting, if I ask people before my preamble, if I ask them, is Ardbeg Ugadel and Ardbeg Corrie Vrecken cask strength? They'll go, yes, it is. It's not. It's diluted. It can't be. It's the exact same strength every single year.
Every year, yeah.
You can't naturally achieve the exact same strength every year. The exception is Glenfarclas with their 105. And what they actually do is they have a high strength fat and a low strength fat, and they blend it to perfectly get to 60%. It's a bit of black arts there. But what everyone else does is they dilute it down and they put a trendy little ABV in there. Highland Park are a good example of this. They put 48.2%, 48. And the thing is, in bottling, you don't even have to blend it, dilute it to 42.2. There's a 2% margin of error. So you can bottle it to bang on 48, but the labelers will print it at 48.2. So it looks like a single cask. But if you read those labels, it doesn't say single cask anywhere. It's just, they're just avoiding the conversation. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. It just is what it is. It's probably ultimately to avoid confusion, just ignore it. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to admit, yeah, we add water. We use water almost like an ingredient, like we use whiskey. So when we first made these whiskeys, they came in at like 62%. Again, whiskey as young as 5, whiskey as old as 12 combined together. So at cash strength, they were like 63. They were just too intense. So what I thought about was, well, what strength would suit the liquid? So when we did the first batch of the Hive, I think it was 54.5, because I wanted the intensity of sweetness, but I didn't want any alcohol burn. So we sat there and just added a little bit of water at a time, a little bit of water, the exact same way we would say add a little bit of Islay, a little bit of Islay whiskey, just a drop of water. I kept tasting it, and then we're like, yeah, that ABV, it works. We've got the roundness, we've got the intensity, but we don't have alcohol burn. Spice King, we changed it up. We go for a slightly higher ABV because I want that effervescence. I want that kind of tickling of the tongue to complement the spice. And then with that first batch of Peat Chimney, man, I just remember drinking like Port Charlottes at SMWS that were stupidly strong. I sometimes just love the intensity of high alcohol with high smoke.
67% Port Charlotte, stuff like that, yeah.
Exactly. So we obviously don't get to that with this one, but it's still fairly high ABV on the scale. And that first batch of the batch strengths, that first bottling of the batch strengths in 2017, the Hive and Spice King, we tweaked the recipes a little bit. So the Hive version has a little bit more sherry cask in it. The Spice King, we introduce a peated whiskey from the Isle of Mull that I cannot disclose. to help give some maritime character. But Peat Chimney, it's the exact same recipe. So I've got Peat Chimney core range, 46%.
Yep.
The exact same recipe as batch 1 Peat Chimney. What I wanted to find out is, how does flavor change just from alcohol strength?
Yep.
Exact same liquid, but at different strength at different bottlings. Alcohol, as I said earlier, is solvent. It encloses, it keeps molecules together. You know, if you rub alcohol on your skin, it feels cool because it's sucking everything in. It's the same with whiskey. That's why we add water, because the ethanol then lowers and it releases the aroma compounds.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to see what that difference in ABV would play into the blend. So yeah, exact same recipe, but just knocked up at 11%.
Right, that's cool.
Batch 2 is different. Batch 2, I think we used almost no Isla, and there is still some Isla, but it's primarily peated Highlands. So the batch, if you want consistency from us, go for the core range. The white label's at 46%, but the batches are different. We did this because we've got customers in Germany, Sweden, Taiwan who like high strength. You know, they drink cask strength whiskey or overproof bourbons or rums. So we wanted to interest that market. Admittedly, in Belgium, it's not a big hitter, because what I noticed with Belgians is you tend to drink the whiskey at the strength it is in the bottle, and you don't really look at dilution that much. So I think for some of the Belgian market, they just found it too extreme.
Have you
generalizing there is an audience in Belgium for it, but not as big as there is in Germany or in Taiwan.
Well, I was kind of wanting to ask that question because I noticed that a lot of the whiskey people I know are, and I'll put it quite bluntly, but cask strength or nothing. And what I saw was with your colleagues from Cadenheads, they now announced that they will be replacing their single cask strength series or the small batch series with the original collection, a new series, which is all bottled at 46%. And there was a huge uproar about that, because why don't we get our cask strength whiskies anymore? And I'm like,
so they won't bottle any cask strength.
Well, they still be bottling cask strength whiskies, but they will be for the Cadenhead shops only, or for the distillery exclusives, or for really exclusive bottlings. But the core range will be 46%, as I have understood.
I can't speak for them.
No, of course not. But the main idea is.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. What if you ask them what is their reasoning behind it? What's the thought process? There's a Cadenhead in Belgium, is there not?
No.
Am I thinking of the Netherlands?
I don't think there's one in Belgium, and not in Netherlands either. But the main idea was, when I don't really care if it's cask strength or not. I mean, it just needs to be good whiskey for me. If it's bottled at 40 or 46 or 43 or 55, I don't care. But there seems to be a lot of people that are really vehement about this. They want their stuff as it's from the cask. And what I noticed that with Wemyss, and I'll finish my question then, is that you bottle a lot of stuff at 46%, even the single casks, and I can really appreciate that. But is there a reasoning behind that, or?
Yep. So the main reason, sorry, I was kind of half interrupting in your question.
No worries, man.
The main reason is where we originate from and who we primarily sell to, and that's France. And just as I was saying, Belgium, to generalize, most Belgian whiskey consumers drink at the strength in the bottle. French are exactly the same, probably to more extreme amount. So cask strength single malt, if you go back to 2005, it just wasn't that common, and it wasn't a desired drinking strength, and it wasn't thought about. The idea of bottling cask strength wasn't thought about. I mean, they probably thought 46 was pushing it, because most whiskey was 40%. The only exceptions were when Charlie stepped in. So as I was saying, Charlie and Isabella, they would taste these samples. If Charlie went, no, for whatever reason, this whiskey works better at higher strength, or we're going to lose something when I dilute it, it comes out weird or releases sulfurs in a sherry cask, that kind of thing, he would say, no, this has to be bottled at cask strength. Since I've jumped in the last 4 years, and as admittedly our stocks have got older, we don't have a lot of teenage stock, we've got a lot of 20, 30-year-old single casks. That will change soon, but I just kind of felt there's a respect to the liquids at a certain age where you shouldn't really tinker with it too much. So a lot of our older releases now, I kind of, at one point I had a discussion with Isabella where it's like, should we just say everything above 25 is cask strength? But it's not as simple as that. You've got to look at the casks case by case. But I am pushing for more and more of our casks to be bottled at higher strength. We take a hit on that, and because you have less bottles at the end of the day.
Sure, yeah.
But it can't always be about money. It's got to be about the quality of the liquid as well. You've got to fight that fight and kind of balance. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But I'm more and more of those casks I'm getting out at a higher strength. But that's not to say that whiskey bottled at 46 is bad or at 40%.
Yeah.
As you said, some people are very much in that camp. I was in that camp. I had 4 years at SMWS where everything was cask strength. We used to have 81% rum on the bar.
Wow.
Ridiculous stuff. And my palate just got so used, or thought it got so used to high ABV, that when I went and set up my whiskey shop on the Mile and I was drinking like 40% Dalmores, I was like, this doesn't taste like juice.
Yeah, it's lemonade.
So you've got to get the balance. And that's the other thing with Weems is like most of our blended malts, if you look at the old stock, the 8 and the 12, they're all 40%. I'm glad we don't do that anymore. 46 to me, it's not just about chill filtration. That is a good ABV to get some intensity of flavor still without the alcohol burn. That's not to say there's lower ABV whiskies that aren't good. Sometimes they naturally get to that strength through age. I think Aberfeldy 12, I can't remember if that's 40 or 43, but I think that's a good example of a whiskey that's pleasant at a lower ABV. There are times and places, not everything has to be cask strength, but also not everything should be diluted. But yeah, and then we have batch strength, kind of bringing it back to this, which weirdly fits in the middle. And it just baffles people. We could have just ignored it. We could have just called it Spice King Strong.
Spicier King. Spicier King.
And just pretended it was cask strength.
Or Spice Emperor.
But we tried to explain it, but it just baffled people, this idea of using water as a tool. I also think there's an argument to be made that if you have one single cask and it's 60% and another single cask and it's 43% and you blend those together, I think there's an argument to be made there about, is that truly cask strength?
Yeah, sure.
Diluting the other. And that's what Glenfarclas do, and it's absolutely amazing. When I learned that, it blew my mind. Their Glenfarclas 105 is legitimately cask strength because they have a batch of liquid that they fill into the cask at 67, 68%, and they have another lot that they fill at 63. So they end up with, it's like cider makers in England. You have sweet cider and dry cider, and then they'll blend you a medium cider. Glenfarclas do the same. They have a high ABV and a low ABV, and they'll blend you a 60% Glenfarclas 105. Absolutely amazing, ingenious way of working.
Yeah.
But for us, we went for the water dilution to get to an ABV that suits each batch. So we've done batch 2. I think we're like 2/3 of the way through that stock. So we'll maybe look next year at producing
batch 3. Yeah.
And we don't keep it to the same recipe all the time. I like a little bit of experimentation and a play around. It's just a little bit of fun for us to come up with something slightly different in each one of those. And as long as I can still justify it fits in the sweet flavor profile or the spicy flavor profile or the smoky flavor profile, I think it's fine calling it Hive, Spice King, Peat, Chimney.
Sure.
It's got that variety in there.
Cool. No, good answer. Somebody wanted to say something.
Yeah, Jeroen, maybe more a question for you.
Yeah.
And some people said, let's not go in there, but someone asked.
I was going into the questions in the chat, but go ahead.
Yeah. If you say Belgium market, which profile is typically Belgium then?
Yeah, describe a typical Belgian to us, Stephen.
Oh, that's hard. I couldn't describe a typical Belgian. I've been all over, and obviously people from Brussels are very different from people in Ghent or Antwerp. My only generalization about Belgium is that one thing that I've noted that most people don't dilute their whiskey, and that's not only to Belgium. That's France as well. So that's the only generalization I have, really. I don't.
But that's also what I remember from the whole idea is, and something that hasn't really occurred to me. But Belgians are really different from Germans or French, but even in the way they drink their whiskey or what they prefer, like on the ABV. So that's something I have to think about a little bit more. But
my understanding, and this is not well researched and hand-me-down knowledge, but my understanding of Belgium is that you had a prohibition on spirits at some point for quite a long period of time, and instead that's why you kind of leaned into higher strength beer brewing.
That's basically true. So in the beginning, I think it was the 1910s or 20s, they prohibited Genever from being poured in bars. You could drink it, you could buy it, you could drink it, but they couldn't pour it in bars. So as a result, the beer market began to grow, and there were more beers began to be brewed. And then it was only in the 1980s, 1985, I think, that they lifted that ban, and then Genever and other spirits were back allowed into bars.
Yeah, because I think of Genevieve typically as a Dutch drink, but it's probably not right. It's probably in both.
No, that's ours.
Yeah, and restricted. And God, that Genevieve bar in
the Vagant
in
Antwerp. Oh no,
God,
hey.
There's a Genevieve bar in, I think it's in Ghent, and I went with some whiskey ambassadors, and the floor was so sticky that it ripped,
small one.
Yeah, it ripped the sole off my shoe.
Yeah, a druppelkot.
Druppelkot, yes.
Yeah.
And some of that stuff's grim. It's like coconut flavored, but I love trying just the pure distillate ones, because I'm always interested in just pure distillate. As much as whiskey is as much about the cask as it is about the spirit. In terms of blending and learning about spirit character, I love trying new make spirits. So I was very interested in trying some of those Genevieves, and
good Genevers are really cool. Just to get into a couple of the remarks in the chat before I go to a little poll about what your favorite whiskeys were for the night. It's about the. I think this is about the Peat Chimney. It's really meaty, makes me think of sushi. So meaty and sushi in the same sentence.
Well, you can some Bowmores actually. I find if you get old refill Bowmores, I sometimes get a kind of sashimi kind of almost like tuna mineralic note coming through.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is something that can be detected on Islays sometimes.
There's someone saying it pairs well with my beef jerky. I can imagine that.
Yeah.
Sven would put it in a needle and into his beef and then on the barbecue. I think that's a good idea. Very drinkable. Nick is asking, are the Hive and the Spice King the core range bottles, or are these batch strengths as well? So you've got both actually, right?
Yeah, so we produce, it's like a mirror. We do the core range of 46, and then we do the batch. But for this tasting, it was 46% core range for Hive and Spice King, and then batch 1 for Peat Chimney. Yeah,
it's because I wanted to add one of each to the tasting, and I wanted the whole core range to be represented, so that's why I put all three in. So guys, I'm putting a poll into the I think it's the chat. I don't know how these polls work. I've never used this before, but it's basically a list of the 8 drams we've had. Just indicate which one was your favorite, so I have a little idea of which ones you liked the best. This should launch now. You should see this, I think, probably. I don't know. We'll let this go on for a minute.
Yes, we see it. So.
Perfect. It's 10:30, so we've done pretty well, I think.
That's early for
Jeroen, you're missing one. You're missing this our single grain. You only have 7.
I didn't put the single grain in there.
Okay.
Okay, so if I forgot about that. I know that's kind of strange because I did put that in. Well, anyway, if you want to vote for the Invergordon, put it in the chat and I'll add that up and I'll be my own Excel machine. So don't worry about that. Just put Invergordon or grain, or you silly man, you forgot the Invergordon in the poll, something like that, and I'll work that out.
Yeah. So, John, you were asking about generalizations with Belgians. This is probably my fault as much as the audience's, but one of the generalizations I'll make with Belgian tastings is they're usually twice as long as tastings anywhere else, and that's totally my fault because I ramble and go on tangents, but people listen and maybe they're too polite and don't say shut up. But some of the tastings I've done in Belgium have lasted 3.5, 4 hours long, which is kind of
I'll be completely honest, and I don't know if I speak for everybody, but we started with the Kingsbarns, and that took us the longest time because we talked about it for about 40 minutes, and I really didn't even notice that it was 40 minutes until after 40 minutes I looked at my clock and I was like, okay, let's go on to the second one because
it's a tricky one because you're talking about a whole new distillery.
Sure.
So there's obviously a lot to talk about there, but yeah, it happens.
But I mean, I don't think anybody minded I speak for myself, and everybody can add to that. But I really enjoyed this talk to you and this explanation of all what that Wemyss and Kingsbarns is about. I've learned a lot actually, and that's always nice to notice that you've learned a lot. I've had some really good drams. I didn't have these drams before tonight. I did have the Hive and the Spice King, but the single cask I haven't had yet. But yeah, really big fan. You can all join in afterwards and tell me what you thought about this. If there's any more questions, there'll be a little more time after I finish talking. So please just shout out. Yeah, I'll put the link for the shop for the bottles if you want some bottles into the chat, and I'll mail it to you after the tasting too. We put a deadline on it for Tuesday, so if you want any bottles, just order through there before Tuesday, and I will make sure you get them if they're still available, because some of them were pretty limited in availability, but I'll do my best for you. The festival is now our main objective for the next month and a half. So if anybody wants to join one of the tastings, please get a ticket. If you want to know more about that, just give me a mail, call me, whatever. You have my my contacts on the website. Always happy to talk about drinks. And also you can really help us by sharing the festival, sharing everything about what we're doing, because we want to make this, I mean, it's really difficult for us because normally the festival, we have about 1,000 people in a day passing by and having a jolly good time and drinking and tasting and talking to people. We can't have that now. So we're trying to make a good alternative. So any help you can give us, even if you're not coming, share about it, talk about it, invite your friends. That would be really nice. And then for the rest, just if you're not a fan on Facebook, just become our friends. If you're not on the mailing list yet, just send me an email. I'll add your mailing address so you get kept in touch about whatever we're doing. We're planning more of these kinds of tastings, more specialist tastings too. Where I'm looking at a new sherry tasting. We'll probably be doing a very exclusive tasting with our big friend Bert Braneel from Asta Morris in December, if we get that sorted out. So keep an eye on that. But yeah, we're always happy to host tastings. And now, the tastings all in Schilde. Somebody's asking. No, usually we're in Antwerp. I have now launched a tasting academy, which is from October till December, every week a tasting in a restaurant here nearby where I live in Schilde. That's whiskey, beer, gin, rums, wines, Porto, bit of everything, basically. So yeah, no, we're basically hosting tastings everywhere. You can also always call us too if you want to host a tasting privately for your company, for your friends, for your organization. Happy to work out something. But yeah, I'll open the floor to a couple questions maybe for Stephen if you have more left, and I'll check out the poll in the meantime and what you're saying in the chats.
Jeroen, can I say something to end?
Sure, man.
So thanks Jeroen and Stephen to host this session for our Whisky Club. For the members, and even if people are not member but are still interested, the 23rd of October we have our next tasting. It will be one of Scotch Malt Whisky Society. We are looking to do it on site in our tasting room, to call it. But we have still to look for it, if it's possible or not. So we will let you know on time. You will get the invite one of the next few days or something. So, okay, that's it, I think, for that announcement for the club.
Cool. Barry, did you want to say something? Because you raised your hand at me, but I don't know if it was for me or for the group.
Raised the hand and Sven was already speaking. So
Perfect.
no beating about the bush anymore. Cut the crap. First, I want to say I'm very grateful to our new members. That's for sure. They are going to be well prepared for the next tasting. But I'm very grateful to Stephen and yourself for hosting this tasting and to do all the work. So I'm very grateful. This will be my last word of the evening, and then I won't be online anymore. So everyone will hear in the future from us. Okay.
Cool, guys. I'm I've looked at the polling here. It's quite divided actually, because actually 4 people voted for the Invergordon in the chat, and then we've got the Spice King, the Clynelish, and the Bunnahabhain all at 3 votes. The Kingsbarns has 1 perfect vote, but a lot of people are saying in the chat that they are really liking it too, second or third. So it's quite yeah, a shared winners, I think.
Only then just one remark. So if the voting is that divided, that means that the total range of Wim's products is very good. So
Yeah, it's reflective of what we want to achieve. You know, there's great distillery tastings. You know, some of my favorites like Arran and Kilchoman, where you get one standout because someone's brought out a super rare cask or really unusual. But Wemyss is about fitting to, as I said earlier, it's about getting to individual tastes and what people like. So it's always going to be divided, and that's fine because we cater to all those different tastes. So
all right, guys. I don't know. I hear some background noise somewhere. I don't know where it is, but so are there any more questions you would like to ask right now? Anything you want to share or talk about, or whiskey related, of course?
One bottle of Kingsbarns Bunnahabhain and Invergordon for me, please. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments. I mean, that's fine. I mean, it's an hour later for you guys. It's always incredible that people sit and listen to me chat for as long as they do. But yeah, there's no questions. It's all good.
Oh yeah. One more question in the chat, Stephen. Can you share your PowerPoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's very rough and ready. I take slides and then just chuck in like those Strathmill slides with just pictures and stuff. But what would be the best way of doing that? Can I?
Yeah, mail it to me. I'll make sure that everybody gets it.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's literally tailored just for this tasting with a few notes in there. But there's hopefully some stuff of interest there. Yeah, I'd happily share that.
People are saying I like it rough and ready, so
okay.
Don't worry about it. I think it's getting to that time of the evening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, Barry, the recording will be available. I'll edit a little bit on this, so the chit chat before and on the end won't be in it, but I'll put it on the YouTube channel for Meug and share the link with all of you.
We will see the email coming and we will forward it to our members.
Yeah,
I'll send it on.
Well, and I think the best way is Hans is saying in the chat, I think none of us have questions left because your explanation was extremely thorough. Thanks a lot.
How polite.
I think that was directed at me, but well, no.
Sure. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I mean, the other thing to say, if you do have questions, Stephen@wemyssmalts.com, or go on wemyssmalts.com and just go on the contact form. We're a small company. There's only like 4 of us in the marketing department and whiskey department. If you go on the website and contact, it's literally coming to me. So yeah, you can always get hold of me on that, or just find me on social media as well. We do have, if you're interested in Kingsbarns and Wemyss, there are whiskey clubs. They're free. I mean, they're essentially glorified newsletters. But when you join that newsletter, we look at offering samples out when we do reviews for new products. We sometimes do exclusive bottlings and things. But yeah, you can either join the Wemyss Malts Cask Club or the Kingsbarns Cask Club. But yeah, just thank you very much for taking the time. You know, blended malts isn't usually the most kind of sexiest of categories of whiskey, but I think it takes people who have a real interest in spirits and Scotch in general to sit and take the time to learn about these things, to kind of push past the preconceptions of single malts better than blend and that kind of thing. So yeah, I really appreciate the time spent today. So yeah, thank you, and in honor of that, I'll cheers and raise a toast, and a toast to all the people on the Zoom calls who probably aren't wearing any trousers. Cheers.
Perfect. Stephen, also from my part, thanks a lot for the evening. Before I release you into the Edinburgh evening, I guess. But no, thanks a lot. Hoping to see you soon at a live event sometime.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah, next time I get to Bel, like I tried to go at least twice a year. At one point, I was actually considering coming and moving over for 6 months. But yeah, it's one of my favorite places to visit. So as soon as we can do it again and do tastings in person, yeah, I'll be there.
Whenever in Antwerp, I'll show you all the good beer bars.
Good.
Cheers,
Right.
man.
Okay,
See you
guys.
later.
I'll leave you to it then. Have a lovely weekend, and good night. Bye.
Bye.